Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Christopher Nighthawk, and I need to tell you what really happened at Raven Rock in the spring of 1973. People think I predicted that earthquake through some fancy science equipment, but that's not the whole truth. What I found in those caves changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'd been a park ranger for 12 years by then, working the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. My specialty was geological surveys and cave safety. Basically, I crawled around in dark holes underground and made sure they wouldn't collapse on tourists. It wasn't glamorous work, but I understood rocks and limestone better than most people understood their own backyards. At 38, I'd seen enough strange things in caves to know that most of them had simple explanations. Weird sounds, wind moving through limestone passages, cold spots, underground water streams, glowing formations, minerals reflecting light in unusual ways. My Cherokee grandfather used to tell stories about singing stones and spirit voices, but I figured those were just old tales mixing with natural cave acoustics. The hearing loss in my left ear didn't help matters. Shrapnel from Vietnam had damaged something inside, leaving me with partial deafness that made every sound seem a little off. Maybe that's why I noticed the wrongness at Raven Rock before anyone else did. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in March. Hikers had reported strange noises coming from the Raven Rock area, sounds like singing or chanting echoing from inside the mountain. The local Cherokee families who lived nearby had started avoiding the trails, which was unusual. They'd been walking those paths for generations. Probably just spring melt causing new water flows, my supervisor said, handing me the incident report. Take your equipment and check it out. Make sure the cave system is stable. Raven Rock sat 16 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a hiking trail that wound through thick forest. The limestone formation rose 200 feet above the tree line, riddled with natural caves that the Cherokee had used for ceremonies long before white settlers arrived. I'd mapped most of the cave system over the years, 7 main chambers connected by narrow passages, with underground streams that flowed down toward the valley. The hike took me 3 hours, carrying 40 pounds of geological equipment on my back. Seismic monitors, acoustic measurement tools, structural analysis gear, and emergency supplies. Standard procedure for cave investigation. But something felt wrong from the moment I reached the base of Raven Rock. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing around the early spring flowers. Even the wind seemed muffled, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. My equipment registered normal readings, temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure all within expected ranges. Yet my skin prickled with the feeling that I was being watched. The main cave entrance yawned open like a black mouth in the limestone face. I'd been inside dozens of times before, but today it looked different somehow. Deeper, more threatening. I shook my head, blaming my imagination, and switched on my headlamp. The cave felt wrong too. I'd spent hundreds of hours underground, and every cave has its own personality. Some feel welcoming, others neutral, a few definitely hostile. But Raven Rock felt aware, like it knew I was there and was deciding what to do about it. My first stop was Chamber 1, just inside the entrance. I set up the seismic monitor and took baseline readings of rock stability and water flow. Everything looked normal on paper, but the silence was unnatural. Most caves echo with dripping water or small sounds bouncing off stone walls. This place was absolutely quiet, and that quiet seemed to press against my eardrums like deep water. I spent the rest of the afternoon mapping temperature variations and checking structural integrity. The limestone showed no signs of stress or recent movement. Water levels were normal for spring melt. Air circulation was good. By every scientific measurement, Raven Rock was a perfectly stable, unremarkable cave system. So why did I feel like something was watching me from the deeper chambers? I should have left when the sun started setting, but professional pride kept me working. If hikers were hearing strange sounds, I needed to find the source. Probably just wind moving through new passages opened by spring flooding. That's when I heard the first note. Low, soft, almost like someone humming in the distance. It seemed to come from Chamber 7, the deepest part of the cave system. I checked my acoustic equipment, but the sensitive microphones registered nothing unusual, just normal cave ambiance. But I could hear it clearly, a single, sustained tone that made my good ear vibrate strangely. Following the sound deeper into the mountain, I noticed my equipment acting up. The seismic monitor showed rhythmic patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat. The temperature gauge flickered between readings that made no sense, sometimes showing the cave was freezing, other times registering tropical heat. Equipment malfunction, I muttered, but my voice sounded flat and strange in the heavy air. The humming grew stronger as I approached Chamber 7. Not louder, exactly, but more present, like it was surrounding me instead of coming from one direction. My headlamp beam seemed dimmer than usual, barely penetrating the thick darkness ahead. Chamber 7 was the largest space in the cave system, with a high ceiling that disappeared beyond my light. I'd mapped it thoroughly before, roughly circular, 40 feet across, with a small underground stream running along one wall. Nothing special about it except the Cherokee had sometimes used it for ceremonies. Tonight, it felt different. The humming filled the chamber now, a rich harmonic that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I swept my light across the limestone surfaces, looking for cracks or openings that might explain the acoustic phenomenon. What I found made me freeze. New cave paintings covered the north wall. I'd been in this chamber dozens of times. I knew every formation, every mineral stain, every natural marking on those walls. But now, painted in what looked like fresh ochre and charcoal, were symbols I'd never seen before. Cherokee pictographs mixed with images I couldn't identify. And in the center, a detailed drawing of a man with a headlamp and survey equipment. A man who looked exactly like me. My hands shook as I set down my pack and pulled out the camera. This was impossible. The cave had been sealed by rockfall for almost a year until the spring melt cleared the entrance 3 weeks ago. No one could have gotten inside to paint these images. But there they were, still damp to the touch. The humming changed pitch, becoming more complex. Multiple tones wove together in harmonies that made my damaged ear ring painfully. I pressed the good side of my head against the cool limestone, trying to understand what I was hearing. That's when the wall spoke to me, not in words, in feelings that somehow bypassed my ears and went straight into my mind. Images flooded my consciousness. Cherokee shamans sitting in this chamber centuries ago, listening to the same harmonics. Warriors coming here for vision quests. Medicine men receiving prophecies from voices in the stone. And underneath it all, a presence vast and patient, and very much alive. I jerked away from the wall, my headlamp beam dancing wildly. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" The humming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it made my ears ache. Then, slowly, it began again. But now it sounded like a response, like the mountain itself was answering me. My seismic equipment went crazy, registering tremors that had no geological explanation. The cave temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. But the most unsettling thing was the way the limestone walls seemed to pulse slightly, like they were breathing. I grabbed my gear and backed toward the passage entrance, every instinct screaming that I was in danger. But as I reached the opening, something made me look back. The cave paintings had changed. New images had appeared in the time it took me to pack my equipment. Scenes showing earthquake damage, collapsed buildings, people running in terror. And in the corner, painted with impossible speed, was a date, 3 days from now. I ran through the dark passages, my headlamp beam bouncing off limestone walls that seemed to watch me go. Behind me, the humming grew into something that sounded almost like laughter. I didn't sleep that night. Back at the ranger station, I spread my photographs and equipment readings across my desk, trying to make sense of what had happened. The pictures showed the cave paintings clearly. They were real, not hallucinations brought on by too much time underground. But the images depicting future earthquake damage made no sense. We hadn't had a significant seismic event in West Virginia for decades. The geology was stable, old mountain rock that had settled into quiet patterns millions of years ago. By morning, I'd convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation. Someone was playing an elaborate prank, though I couldn't figure out how they'd gotten into the sealed cave or painted those images so quickly. Maybe local kids had found another entrance I hadn't mapped yet. I called my supervisor and requested permission to bring in additional equipment for a more thorough investigation. Geological surveys were my specialty. If something unusual was happening in that cave system, I'd find the real cause. The second trip to Raven Rock included portable seismic sensors, gas detection equipment, and a colleague named Dave Martinez, who specialized in underground water systems. If someone was using hidden passages to access the cave, we'd find them. Dave was skeptical from the start. "Sounds like you've been reading too many old Cherokee stories," he said as we hiked up the trail. "Singing stones and spirit voices? Come on, Chris, you know better than that." But even Dave went quiet when we reached the limestone formation. The forest was still too silent, and the cave entrance seemed to exhale cold air that carried a faint sound like distant music. "You hear that?" I asked. Dave tilted his head, listening. Wind through the passages. Nothing unusual about cave acoustics. Inside, our equipment confirmed that something strange was definitely happening. The seismic sensors picked up rhythmic vibrations with no external source. Gas detectors found traces of compounds that shouldn't exist in limestone caves. The temperature kept fluctuating in patterns that followed no natural law. And in Chamber 7, the cave paintings had multiplied. "This is incredible," Dave whispered, running his hands over the fresh images. "These look like traditional Cherokee pictographs, but they're depicting modern events. Look at this. Buildings that match the architecture in Charleston. And this date. The same date I'd seen before, now repeated in multiple images, 3 days away. That's when we found the artifacts. Scattered around the chamber were objects that had no business being in a sealed cave. A wristwatch stopped at 3:17, a child's toy truck, a newspaper from next week. All of them looked like they'd been placed there recently, but that was impossible. The cave had been completely inaccessible until we'd cleared the entrance. Dave picked up the newspaper and stared at the headline, Earthquake devastates Charleston, hundreds, feared dead. This has to be a fake, he said, but his voice was shaking. Someone's playing a very sick joke. The humming started again while he was speaking, but now I could see it wasn't coming from hidden speakers or tricks. The limestone walls themselves were vibrating, producing harmonics that resonated through my bones. Dave heard it too. His eyes went wide as the sound grew stronger. "We need to leave," he said, "right now." But the cave had other ideas. As we tried to exit Chamber 7, the passage we'd entered through was blocked by a solid stone wall. Not collapsed. The limestone looked like it had grown across the opening, sealing us inside. Dave pounded on it with his flashlight, but the barrier was completely solid. "There has to be another way out," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "Caves don't just seal themselves." The humming became more complex, multiple tones weaving together in patterns that seemed almost like language. And then, impossibly, we began to understand what it was saying. Images filled our minds. Earthquake fault lines running deep under West Virginia, pressure building along underground fractures, tectonic stress reaching critical levels. But these weren't random geological events. They were being shown to us deliberately, like a warning from something that understood the mountain's deep structure better than any human scientist. Dave collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the mental contact. "It's alive," he whispered. "The whole cave system is alive, and it's trying to tell us something." The stone wall began to change, becoming transparent like glass. Through it, we could see other chambers we'd never mapped before, filled with Cherokee artifacts and glowing with soft light that had no visible source. And in the center of it all, translucent figures that looked like people but were made of the same limestone as the cave walls. Ancient shamans, somehow preserved within the living rock. One of them stepped forward and looked directly at me. When he spoke, I heard the words both aloud and inside my head. "The mountain remembers all earthquakes. The next one comes in 3 days. Many will die unless you warn them." The wall solidified again, leaving us trapped in Chamber 7 with knowledge we weren't sure we could trust. But as the hours passed, and the cave continued to share its impossible visions, I realized we had no choice. The mountain was trying to save lives, and it had chosen us to carry the warning. The cave released us at dawn, the stone wall simply melting away like it had never existed. Dave and I stumbled out into daylight carrying evidence that no one would believe. Photographs of impossible cave paintings, seismic readings that defied explanation, and the absolute certainty that we'd communicated with something beyond human understanding. Dave headed straight for the ranger station to call in a geological emergency. I knew he was right, to follow proper channels, but I also knew that official reports and committee meetings would take weeks. If the cave's warning was true, we had less than 48 hours. So I did something that would either save thousands of lives or destroy my career. I drove to Charleston and walked into the mayor's office without an appointment. "You need to evacuate the downtown area," I told Mayor Patterson, spreading my photographs across his desk. "There's going to be a major earthquake day after tomorrow at 3:17 p.m. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Ranger Nighthawk, West Virginia doesn't have earthquakes. Our geological surveys show stable bedrock throughout the region." "Your surveys are wrong," I said. "I have evidence of seismic activity building along previously unknown fault lines. The Cherokee shamans have been predicting this event for generations." That was when I made the mistake of mentioning the supernatural elements. Mayor Patterson's expression changed from skepticism to concern about my mental health. Security escorted me out of the building with instructions not to return. But I couldn't give up. The cave had shown me too much. Visions of collapsed buildings, trapped families, emergency workers digging through rubble. Whether anyone believed me or not, I had to try. I spent the next day driving to every emergency services office in the region. Police stations, fire departments, hospitals, schools. Most people listened politely and then filed my warnings under concerned citizen reports. A few took me seriously enough to check with state geological services, who confirmed that no seismic activity was expected. By evening, I was exhausted and starting to doubt my own sanity. Maybe I had suffered some kind of breakdown in the cave. Maybe the stress of isolation and strange acoustics had caused me to hallucinate the whole thing. That's when Joseph Ravenfeather found me. The old Cherokee man was waiting by my truck when I came out of the last fire station. I'd never met him before, but something about his weathered face and patient eyes made me stop and listen. "You've been to the Singing Stones," he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" My grandfather was the last shaman to receive visions from Raven Rock. He told me that one day, when the danger was greatest, the stones would choose someone to carry their warning, someone who could walk in both the white world and the Cherokee world. I stared at him. "You believe me?" "The stones don't lie, Christopher Nighthawk. They've been watching over this land for centuries, protecting the people even when the people forgot how to listen. Tomorrow at 3:17, the earth will shake exactly as they showed you." Joseph had connections I didn't. Cherokee families throughout the region who still remembered the old stories and trusted the wisdom of the sacred sites. By midnight, we had quietly spread the word through a network of tribal, elders, local pastors, and community leaders who understood that some knowledge comes from sources outside official channels. The morning of the predicted earthquake, hundreds of people found excuses to stay away from downtown Charleston. Kids were kept home from school with sudden illnesses. Office workers called in sick. Construction crews discovered urgent projects elsewhere. No mass evacuation, no panic, just a quiet exodus of people who trusted ancient warnings more than modern geology. At 3:15 p.m., I stood on a hill overlooking the city, holding a portable seismic monitor and praying I was wrong. At 3:17 exactly, the earth moved. The earthquake lasted 93 seconds and registered 6.8 on the Richter scale. It collapsed 2 office buildings, shattered windows throughout the downtown area, and cracked the foundation of Charleston's main hospital. But because so many people had heeded the supernatural warning, the death toll was 12 instead of the hundreds the cave had shown me. The official investigation credited my advanced seismic analysis techniques and innovative application of traditional geological knowledge for predicting the event. No one asked too many questions about my methods. They were just grateful that someone had taken the threat seriously enough to sound the alarm. But I knew the truth. The Cherokee shamans, sleeping in the limestone depths of Raven Rock, had reached across centuries to save their people's descendants. The Singing Stones had chosen a messenger who could walk between worlds, and together we had cheated death of a terrible harvest. That earthquake changed everything for me. Not just because it proved the cave's impossible knowledge was real, but because it forced me to accept a truth I'd been running from my whole life. I was Cherokee enough to hear the stones sing, and that came with responsibilities I couldn't ignore. Over the following months, I quietly contacted other park rangers and geological surveyors working near Cherokee sacred sites throughout Appalachia. The stories they told me were remarkably similar: strange readings, equipment malfunctions, and growing evidence that something was awakening in the ancient ceremonial locations. The Raven Rock entity Whatever combination of natural forces and spiritual presence it truly was, seemed to be part of a larger network. Cherokee shamans had chosen sacred sites for their ceremonies because the land itself held power there. Geological formations that could store and transmit information across centuries, mountain consciousness that remembered every earthquake and could predict the next one. I started working as an unofficial liaison between the Park Service and tribal elders, documenting reports of unusual activity and learning to interpret the warnings that came from living stone. It wasn't a job description that existed in any government manual, but it was work that needed doing. The hearing loss in my left ear turned out to be an advantage. The frequency ranges that the cave entities used to communicate were partially blocked by my damaged eardrum, filtering out distracting noise and letting me focus on the harmonics that carried actual meaning. What I'd thought was a disability was really a kind of natural radio tuning that made me sensitive to voices most people couldn't hear. 6 months after Raven Rock, I successfully predicted a rock slide in North Carolina by listening to warnings from a Cherokee ceremonial cave. 8 months later, I helped evacuate a campground in Tennessee before a flash flood that would have killed dozens of families. Each time, the official reports credited my geological expertise and innovative surveying techniques. Nobody talks about the singing stones or the shamans preserved in living limestone. That knowledge stays within the Cherokee community and a small network of rangers who've learned to listen to voices older than written history. But the stones are still singing in Raven Rock and sacred sites throughout the mountains. They're waiting for people who remember how to hear them, watching over the land and the people who walk on it. Sometimes they warn of natural disasters. Sometimes they share knowledge about healing plants or lost tribal history. And sometimes they just sing for the joy of being remembered by someone who understands their ancient purpose. I still work for the Park Service, but my real job is keeping the old agreements alive. Cherokee shamans promised to protect this land forever, and even death couldn't break their commitment. The least I can do is make sure their warnings reach the people who need to hear them. If you're ever hiking in the mountains of West Virginia, North Carolina, or Tennessee, and you come across a place where the silence feels deeper than it should, where the rocks seem to hum with patient energy, stop and listen. You might be standing on sacred ground where ancient guardians are still watching over their people. The stones remember everything, and they're still trying to help us remember too. My name is Robert Steele River, but everyone just calls me Bobby. I've been working for the Forest Service for 14 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Boy, was I wrong. It was April 1977 when they sent me to Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. The brass needed someone to check out an old strip mining area near Cumberland Gap. The EPA wanted to know if we could clean up the mess those mining companies left behind. Since I grew up in coal country and knew mining better than most forest rangers, I got the job. I remember driving up that muddy road for the first time, rain beating on my windshield like angry fists. The whole area looked like a giant had taken a shovel to the mountainside. Huge terraces cut into the rock, black water pooling in the bottom, and not a single green thing growing anywhere. It made my stomach turn. My daddy worked coal mines his whole life, just like his daddy before him. When I was 18, he expected me to follow the family tradition and go underground. But I'd seen what those mines did to men. The black lung, the cave-ins, the way they aged 10 years for everyone they spent in the dark. When I told him I was going to study forestry instead, he didn't speak to me for 6 months. Now here I was, 41 years old, standing in the ruins of everything my family had lived and died for. The irony wasn't lost on me. I parked my Forest Service truck at what used to be the main gate. The metal signs were so rusted you could barely read them, but I could make out Blackwater Mining Company and a date, 1962. That was the year of the big explosion. 47 men died when methane gas ignited in the main shaft. My daddy had friends who worked here. He used to tell stories about the ones who didn't come home. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning everything to thick mud that sucked at my boots. I pulled my gear from the truck, soil testing kit, Geiger counter, camera, and enough sampling containers to fill a lab. The EPA wanted a full environmental assessment before they'd approve any cleanup money. As I walked toward the old mine entrance, I noticed something strange. No birds. In all my years in the forest, I'd never been anywhere so quiet. Even in winter, you'd hear something, a crow, a woodpecker, wind in the trees. Here, the only sound was my own breathing and the squish of mud under my boots. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, steel beams twisted like broken bones. Warning signs hung at crazy angles, telling people to stay out. Most folks around here didn't need signs to keep them away. They had their own reasons for avoiding this place. I'd heard the stories, of course. Local people claimed they saw shadow figures moving around the old equipment. Some said you could hear voices calling from the mine shafts on quiet nights. My daddy always said miners were a superstitious bunch, making up ghost stories to explain the very real dangers underground. "Bobby," he'd tell me, "ain't no such thing as mine spirits. Just guilty consciences and bad air playing tricks on tired men." I believed him then. Standing at the edge of that poisoned wasteland, I still believed him. I spent that first day taking pictures and soil samples. Every test I ran came back the same. The ground was so contaminated with heavy metals and acid runoff that nothing could grow. The water was worse, running black as coffee and testing more acidic than vinegar. This wasn't going to be a simple cleanup job. When I set up my tent that evening, the silence felt even heavier. I tried my radio to check in with headquarters but got nothing but static. Cell phones weren't common yet, and even if I'd had one, there were no towers out here. I was on my own until I drove back to town. That first night, I woke up to the sound of metal clanging against metal. It was rhythmic, like someone hammering on an anvil. I checked my watch, 2 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, but the sound stopped the moment I unzipped my tent. Probably just thermal expansion, I told myself. Metal cooling down after a warm day. Nothing supernatural about that. But as I stood there in the dark, listening to the absolute silence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a kid afraid of the dark. The feeling that something was watching me. I went back to sleep, telling myself it was just nerves. New place, sad history, too many ghost stories growing up. In the morning, I'd laugh about it. In the morning, I found my equipment arranged in a perfect circle around my tent. I stared at my testing gear for a full minute before my brain could process what I was seeing. The soil sample containers, my pH meters, even my heavy Geiger counter. Everything was arranged in a neat circle about 10 feet from my tent. I distinctly remembered leaving it all scattered around my work area the night before. Must have been animals, I said out loud, just to hear my own voice. But what animal could move a 30-pound Geiger counter without leaving tracks? I looked closer at the mud. The rain had stopped around midnight, leaving the ground soft and perfect for prints. I could see my own boot marks from the evening before, but nothing else. No paw prints, no drag marks, nothing to explain how my equipment had moved. I tried to push it out of my mind as I started my second day of testing, but every time I set something down and turned away, I found myself glancing back to make sure it was still there. Around noon, I was taking water samples from one of the flooded mine pits when my Geiger counter started clicking like crazy. That didn't make sense. I wasn't expecting radiation in an old coal mine. I followed the signal, watching the needle jump higher as I approached a section of collapsed tunnel. The clicking got faster and faster until it was almost a solid buzz. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence. I tapped the machine, thinking it had broken, but when I moved away from the tunnel, it started working normally again. I marked the spot and came back an hour later with fresh batteries and a backup detector. Same thing happened. Wild readings right at the tunnel mouth, then nothing. I'd never seen equipment malfunction like that. That afternoon, I climbed to a higher terrace to get photos of the whole mining area. Through my camera lens, I could see the layout clearly. The main pit, the equipment yard, the collapsed buildings. But when I developed the film later, there was something in the photos that I hadn't seen with my own eyes. Dark shapes near the mine entrance, human-shaped shadows that seemed to be standing in a group. I held the photos up to the light, thinking maybe it was a developing error, but the shadows were clear and distinct, 5 or 6 figures wearing what looked like hard hats. My hands were shaking when I put the photos down. I'd taken dozens of pictures in that exact spot, and I was certain, absolutely certain, that no one else had been there. That evening I drove to the nearest town to get supplies and make some phone calls. The general store clerk, an old-timer named Pete, asked what I was doing up at Blackwater. Environmental assessment, I told him, seeing if the EPA can clean it up. Pete's face went dark. That place ain't fit for cleaning. Some things are better left buried. What do you mean? He looked around the store like he was checking for eavesdroppers. My brother worked up there in '62. Day of the explosion, he called in sick. Only thing that saved him. Those 47 men who died. Company knew that mine wasn't safe. Knew it for months. How do you know that? Because the men who lived talked. Company tried to shut them up, threatened their jobs, but word got out. Blackwater knew about the gas buildup and sent those boys down anyway. Saved money on ventilation by letting good men die. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to the company? Lawyers made it all go away. Paid some fines, closed the mine, disappeared. Families never got justice. That's why the spirits won't rest. You don't really believe in... Mister, Pete interrupted. I don't know what you believe in, but I know that place has been wrong ever since. Wrong in ways that don't make sense. Driving back to my camp that night, Pete's words echoed in my head. When I parked at the gate, my headlights swept across the equipment yard, and for just a split second, I could swear I saw people moving between the rusted machinery. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I was building a fire when I heard it, the sound of men talking. Voices drifting from the direction of the mine entrance, too far away to make out words, but close enough to know it was human conversation. Multiple voices, overlapping like workers discussing their day. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound. As I got closer, the voices got clearer. I could hear someone saying, "Gas levels are too high," and another voice replying, "Foreman says we go down anyway." My blood turned to ice. Those were the kinds of conversations that happened in 1962, not 1977. I broke into a run, but the moment I clicked on my flashlight, the voices stopped. I swept the beam across the mine entrance, the equipment yard, everywhere the sound could have come from. Nothing. just me and the dead silence. But when I turned to head back to my camp, I saw them. 5 figures standing between me and my truck. Dark shapes against the darker sky, wearing mining helmets with lights that glowed like dim stars. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I looked again, they were gone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I dozed off, I'd hear the sound of pickaxes hitting stone, or voices calling names I didn't recognize. When I finally gave up and sat outside my tent, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. My equipment was arranged in a perfect circle again. But this time, there was something in the center. An old mining helmet, corroded and dented, with a number painted on the front. 47. I should have left right then. Should have packed my truck and driven back to headquarters with whatever data I had. But something kept me there. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe the memory of my daddy calling miners cowards for believing in ghosts. I wasn't going to be scared off by some strange coincidences and my own imagination. The third morning, I decided to focus on the collapsed mine entrance. If there really was radiation in there, the EPA needed to know about it. I put on my hard hat, grabbed my heaviest flashlight, and squeezed through a gap in the twisted steel beams. The air inside was thick and cold, with a metallic taste that reminded me of blood. My footsteps echoed strangely in the darkness, like the sound was bouncing off walls that weren't there. I followed what was left of the main tunnel, testing the air with a gas detector every few steps. About 50 yards in, I found them. Mining equipment arranged in neat rows, as if someone had been organizing the tools for the next shift. Pickaxes, shovels, helmets, lunch pails, all covered in 15 years of dust, but positioned with military precision. No collapse or explosion would have left things so orderly. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that all the helmet lights were on. 47 lights glowing in the darkness, each one sitting on its own piece of equipment. The batteries should have died years ago, but there they were, casting weird shadows on the tunnel walls. I counted them twice to be sure. 47. Exactly the number of men who died. I backed out of that tunnel as fast as I could move. My gas detector was going crazy, but not from methane or carbon monoxide. It was picking up something else, something it wasn't designed to measure. When I got outside, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work my radio. The static was worse than ever, but I finally got through to the Forest Service dispatcher. "Bobby, that you? You're breaking up. I need to talk to environmental. Tell them there's something wrong with this site. The readings don't make sense." "Say again? You're cutting in and out." I said. The radio went dead. When I tried to start it again, nothing. The battery was completely drained, even though I'd charged it that morning. I spent the afternoon trying to convince myself there were logical explanations for everything. Underground electromagnetic fields could affect equipment. Some mines had natural radiation from uranium deposits. Battery acid could leak and create lights that looked supernatural in the dark. But I couldn't explain the voices. I heard them again that afternoon. Men calling to each other, warning about gas levels, talking about needing better ventilation. Always from somewhere I couldn't see, always stopping the moment I got close. Around sunset, I was taking water samples when I noticed something that made me drop my testing kit. Footprints in the mud around the pit. Fresh ones made that day. Boot prints with the deep tread pattern of mining shoes, the kind they wore in 1962. I followed the trail, my heart pounding harder with each step. The prints led from the mine entrance to my campsite, circled my tent 3 times, then headed back. but there were too many prints for one person. Dozens of sets, all walking together like a group of men heading to work. That night, I sat in my truck with the doors locked and the engine running. I told myself I was just being cautious. But the truth was, I was scared. More scared than I'd been since I was a kid hiding under my blankets from monsters that couldn't possibly be real. At 11 o'clock, they came. I saw them through my windshield, a line of men walking across the equipment yard toward the mine entrance. They moved slowly, like they were tired from a long day's work. Each one carried tools and wore the helmet lights I'd seen in the tunnel. They looked as solid as anyone walking down a street, except they left no footprints and made no sound. I counted them as they passed in front of my headlights. 47 men, just like Pete had said, just like the number painted on the helmet they'd left for me. The last man in line stopped and looked directly at me through the windshield. His face was young, maybe 25, with coal dust streaks on his cheeks and kind eyes that reminded me of my daddy. He raised his hand in a small wave, like he was saying hello to an old friend. Then he pointed at something behind my truck. I spun around to look, and when I turned back, they were gone. All of them. Like they'd never been there at all. But behind me, written in the mud on my rear window, was a single word: remember. I drove to town that night and got a motel room. The desk clerk took one look at me and asked if I was feeling okay. I must have looked like hell. Just tired, I told him. You're not the first one to come down from Blackwater looking like that, he said. Most folks don't go back. I lay awake in that motel bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about my daddy, about the stories he used to tell about miners who didn't come home, about the explosion at Blackwater and how it could have been prevented, about 47 men who died because someone decided their lives were worth less than the cost of proper ventilation. In the morning, I called my supervisor and requested backup, told him I needed another team member for safety reasons. He said he'd send someone when he could, but it might be a few days. I drove back to Blackwater because I had a job to do. But this time I wasn't going alone. This time I was bringing something the spirits might want more than my fear. I was bringing the truth. I spent that fourth day in the town library, digging through old newspapers and mining company records. What I found made my blood boil. Pete was right. The company knew Blackwater was dangerous. Internal memos talked about acceptable risk levels and cost-effective safety measures. They'd detected gas buildup 2 weeks before the explosion, but decided it was cheaper to risk it than shut down production for proper ventilation. The explosion happened at 2:17 p.m. on April 15, 1962. The shift foreman had requested a delay to check gas levels, but company executives overruled him. 47 men went into that mountain and never came out. The families sued, but Blackwater's lawyers buried them in paperwork and appeals. Most of the widows settled for pennies just to put food on their tables. The company paid a small fine to the state and walked away clean. No one was ever held responsible. No one went to jail. The dead men weren't even properly buried. Their bodies were sealed in the collapsed tunnel because it was cheaper than excavation. I drove back to the mine site with a fire in my belly and a plan in my head. The EPA assessment could wait. These men deserved better than being forgotten in a poisoned hole in the ground. When I parked at the gate that evening, I noticed my equipment had been moved again. But this time it wasn't arranged in a circle. This time it was lined up in neat rows, like men standing at attention. 47 pieces of gear, one for each of the dead. I walked to the mine entrance and spoke to the empty air. I know what happened here. I know why you're still here. The silence was complete. No wind, no insects, not even the sound of my own heartbeat. It felt like the whole mountain was listening. My name is Bobby Steel River. My daddy was a miner, just like you. I'm here to tell your story. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see the young man from the night before, the one who'd waved at me. He looked solid as life in the fading daylight, except his skin was pale as moonlight, and his eyes held depths that went on forever. "You're Jack Morrison," I said, remembering the name from the newspaper records. Age 24, married 6 months, died trying to warn the others about the gas. He nodded slowly, then pointed toward the mine entrance. Other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Men in mining clothes carrying their tools, their helmet lights creating a soft glow in the darkness. All 47 of them, standing in formation like they were waiting for orders. "They told us it was safe," Jack said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Foreman knew better, but company men made him send us down anyway. We smelled the gas the moment we got in there." "What do you want?" I asked. "Justice," said another voice, and I turned to see an older man with a supervisor's badge. 15 years we've been waiting for someone to tell the truth. 15 years watching them cover it up. "I can write a report," I said. "Include what really happened in my EPA assessment. But I'm just one forest ranger. I don't know if anyone will listen." The supervisor, I recognized him as Tom Bradley from the photos, shook his head. "Company's planning to come back, new owners, same old lies. They want to reopen this mine and put more boys in danger." My heart sank. "How do you know that?" "We hear things, see things. Evil leaves echoes in the earth, Bobby. We've been trying to keep them out, but we're getting weaker. Every year, fewer people remember. Every year, it gets harder to stay." Jack stepped closer, his young face twisted with anguish. "My Sarah remarried 5 years ago. My baby boy calls another man daddy. I don't blame her. She had to move on. But it means there's one less person in the world who remembers what really happened here." I looked around at all their faces, and I saw my own daddy in every one of them. Men who went underground because it was honest work. Men who trusted their bosses to keep them safe. Men who died for someone else's greed. "What can I do?" I asked. "Make them remember," Tom said. "Make it official. Make it permanent." Suddenly, the ground under our feet began to shake. Equipment in the yard rattled and crashed as something moved through the old tunnels. A wind picked up from nowhere, carrying the smell of methane and fear. "They're coming," Jack said urgently. "The new company. They're here now." I heard truck engines in the distance, coming up the mountain road. Headlights swept across the tree line as a convoy of vehicles approached the gate. Even in the growing darkness, I could see corporate logos on the sides. "They can't start mining again," I said. "The EPA hasn't approved anything yet." "They don't need approval for a site survey," Tom replied grimly. "And once they're here, they'll find ways to make the paperwork work out in their favor. Just like before." The spirits around me began to fade, becoming translucent in the truck headlights. I realized they were using all their remaining strength to manifest, to warn me, to make one last plea for justice. "Remember us," Jack whispered as he started to disappear. "Remember what they did to us." The corporate trucks pulled up to the gate, and men in hard hats and expensive suits climbed out. I recognized the type, company executives who'd never spent a day underground but made decisions about men who did. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, walked over to my truck. "You Forest Service?" he asked. "Robert Steel River," Environmental Assessment Team. Well, Robert, I'm afraid you're going to have to clear out. We've got permission for a geological survey starting tonight. From who? He handed me a thick folder of documents. State Mining Authority, all proper and legal. We'll be bringing in heavy equipment tomorrow. I looked through the papers in my headlight beam. They looked official enough, but something felt wrong. Too many signatures, too many stamps, paperwork that should have taken months processed in days. This is a contaminated site, I told him. EPA has to complete environmental review before any new activity. That's a federal matter. This is state business. His smile was the kind salesmen used when they were screwing you. I'm sure your bosses will be informed through proper channels. I looked back toward the mine entrance, but the spirits were gone. 47 men who'd spent 15 years trying to prevent this exact moment faded away because they'd used everything they had left to warn me. Now it was up to me. You can't mine here, I said. Says who? Says me. The silver-haired man laughed. Son, you're just a tree hugger with a clipboard. We're a mining company with lawyers. Guess who's going to win that fight? That's when I smiled. Because I might just be a tree hugger with a clipboard, but I was also a coal miner's son who knew how to fight dirty when he had to. And I had something better than lawyers. I had the truth. The EPA investigation that followed made national news. When I submitted my report documenting the 1962 cover-up along with copies of the internal company memos I'd found, it triggered a federal investigation that went all the way to Washington. The new mining company's permits were revoked. Their proper paperwork turned out to be falsified, bought with bribes and threats. 3 state officials went to jail. The company executives faced federal charges for fraud and corruption. But the real victory came 6 months later, when the federal government declared the Blackwater site a memorial preserve. 47 headstones were placed at the mine entrance, each one bearing the name of a man who died. The families finally had a place to grieve. I was there for the dedication ceremony. As the last family member placed flowers on the last grave, I felt something I'd never experienced before. A sense of peace so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself. The oppressive silence that had haunted the place was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of forest life. Birds sang in the trees. Wind rustled through leaves. Even the water in the mining pits seemed to run clearer. That night, I camped one more time at Blackwater. As I sat by my fire, Jack Morrison appeared one final time. But now his face was calm, younger somehow, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth." He started to fade, but before he disappeared completely, he said something that still gives me chills. "There are other mines, Bobby. Other places where good men died for bad reasons. They're waiting for someone like you." And he was right. Over the next 10 years, I made it my mission to investigate mining disasters throughout Appalachia. Every site had the same pattern: corporate negligence covered up by lawyers and politicians, families left without justice, and strange reports from locals about unexplained phenomena. At each location, I found the same thing: spirits of dead miners trying to prevent new tragedies, growing weaker each year as memory faded. Some were peaceful, like the men at Blackwater. Others were angry, lashing out at anyone who came near. But all of them just wanted their stories told. I helped establish 7 more memorial sites, 7 more places where families could finally say goodbye to fathers and sons and brothers who died in the dark. Each time we honored the dead, the hauntings stopped. Each time we exposed the truth, justice finally came. But there are dozens more sites out there, maybe hundreds. Mining companies have long memories for profitable locations, and they're always looking for ways to reopen old claims. Every few years, I get reports of new activity at places where men died, new plans to dig in cursed ground. The dead remember everything. The living forget too quickly. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because someday you might drive past an abandoned mine and feel like something's watching you. You might hear voices in the wind or see shadows moving in your peripheral vision. You might find your equipment arranged in patterns you didn't make, or discover old mining helmets in places where no one should have left them. When that happens, don't run. Don't ignore it. Don't explain it away as imagination or coincidence. Listen, because the dead have long memories and important things to say. They've been waiting decades for someone to hear them, to believe them, to help them find peace. They've been waiting for someone like you. The Blackwater mine is still there, protected now by federal law and surrounded by 47 white headstones. If you ever find yourself driving through Daniel Boone National Forest, you can visit the memorial site. Families still come to leave flowers and say prayers. Forest rangers give tours to school groups, telling them about mining history and workplace safety. But if you go there at sunset, when the light fades and shadows grow long, you might see something the tour guides don't mention. You might catch glimpses of men in old-fashioned mining gear, walking quietly among the headstones. Not haunting anymore, just visiting, checking on the memorial that finally gave them rest. They're peaceful now. Their story has been told, their sacrifice remembered, their justice served. But somewhere else in these mountains, in some other abandoned mine, 47 different men are still waiting, and they're running out of time. My name is Samuel Crowfeather, though folks around here just call me Sam. I've been a ranger in Jefferson National Forest for 11 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen every kind of trouble these mountains could throw at a man. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. It was August of 1956, and the heat that summer was something fierce. The kind of wet, heavy heat that sits on you like a wool blanket and won't let go. I'd been working search and rescue since I got back from the war, started right after my discharge in '45. Figured after what I saw in France, helping lost hikers find their way home would be easy work, peaceful work. I grew up Baptist in these hills, went to church every Sunday until I shipped out. But after pulling bodies from bombed churches in Normandy, after watching good men die screaming for a God who didn't seem to be listening, well, I stopped believing in much beyond what I could see with my own eyes. These mountains became my church. The tall pines, the clean air, the honest work of saving lives, that was enough faith for me. My station sits 12 miles from the nearest town, up on Peters Mountain, where the old logging roads peter out into deer trails. It's quiet up there. No phone lines, no electricity except what my generator gives me. Mail comes once a week if I'm lucky. Most days, that's exactly how I like it. But that morning in August, I was wishing for a telephone, something fierce. The call came in through the state police radio just after dawn. Missing person, they said. Dr. Helen Morrison, some kind of college professor from up north, studying old religious communities in the mountains. She'd been staying at the boarding house in town for 2 weeks, taking pictures of abandoned churches and talking to old-timers about the way things used to be. Last anyone saw her, she was heading up toward Peters Mountain with her camera gear, said she wanted to photograph the ruins of some old church. I knew the place she meant. Every ranger in Jefferson Forest knew about the old church in Serpent Hollow, even though none of us liked to talk about it. The community that built it had died out in 1934. Some kind of religious accident, the old folks said. Snake bites. Lots of them. The survivors just packed up and left, let the forest take the place back. I'd been past the ruins a few times over the years, usually chasing lost hikers who'd wandered off the main trails. It was a strange place, no doubt about that. The church building was still mostly standing, though the roof had caved in and vines grew through the windows. But what bothered me most was how quiet it was. Even in summer, when the forest should be full of bird song and insect noise, that little valley stayed silent as a tomb. Dr. Morrison had been missing for 3 days. Her landlady said she always came back by dinner time, never stayed out overnight. The state police had already searched the main trails, but they wanted someone who knew the back country to check the more remote areas. I loaded my Jeep with medical supplies and emergency gear, same routine I'd followed 89 times before. Rope, first aid kit, extra water, my old Army surplus medical bag, everything I'd need to patch someone up and get them back to civilization. I'd saved 23 lives with that bag over the years, and I was proud of that number. The drive up to Serpent Hollow took most of the morning. The old logging road was barely wide enough for my CJ3A, and tree branches scraped the canvas top every few yards. As I climbed higher, the temperature should have dropped, but if anything, it seemed to get hotter. The air felt thick, almost hard to breathe. About a mile from the church ruins, I started seeing the snakes. Now, I'd lived in these mountains all my life, and I knew snake behavior as well as any man. They don't like heat like this. They should have been hiding under rocks, staying cool. But they were everywhere. Timber rattlers, copperheads, even a few king snakes, all moving in the same direction, all heading toward the hollow. That was wrong. August was mating season, but this wasn't mating behavior. This was something else entirely. I stopped the Jeep and checked my compass. The needle was pointing toward the church ruins, no matter which way I turned. I tapped the glass, thinking maybe it was stuck, but it kept swinging back to point down into that valley. That should have been my first warning to turn around. The church sat in a natural bowl between 3 ridges, like God had cupped his hands and forgotten something there. As I walked down into the hollow, my boots crunching on dead leaves, the silence hit me like a physical thing. Not just quiet. Silence so complete it made my ears ring. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. I found Dr. Morrison's equipment about 50 yards from the church entrance. Her camera bag, tripod, and notebooks were arranged in a perfect circle around what used to be the altar. The stone altar was cracked right down the middle with thick vines growing up through the split. Every piece of her gear was placed exactly the same distance from the center, like someone had used a measuring tape. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that all her film had been exposed. Not torn out or damaged, just exposed to light, ruined. 5 rolls of film, all blank. I picked up one of her notebooks and flipped through it. Her handwriting was neat, scholarly. She'd been documenting different religious practices in the area, foot-washing ceremonies, river baptisms, speaking in tongues. But the last few entries were different, wilder. The handwriting got shakier as I read. The locals won't talk about what really happened here, she'd written. They say the preacher was handling serpents, but that's not the whole story. Found a diary in town. Preacher was trying to summon something, called it his divine serpent. The ritual was interrupted when the church caught fire in 1934, but the summoning wasn't complete. It's still here, still waiting. The final entry was just one line, written in shaky letters. Summoning successful. God forgive me. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Dr. Morrison had been a serious academic, not some superstitious local, for her to write something like that. A sound came from inside the ruined church, low and rhythmic, like someone humming. I walked closer and realized it was singing. Gospel music, the old kind. "Shall we gather at the river?" sung by what sounded like a full congregation. The church was empty, just broken pews and bird droppings, but the singing continued. I checked my radio, thinking maybe I was picking up some distant station. Nothing but static. The singing seemed to be coming from the building itself, echoing up from somewhere below the floor. As I stood there listening, shadows began moving inside the church. Human shapes, swaying in time with the music. I could see them clearly through the broken windows. Men in dark suits, women in plain dresses, all facing toward where the pulpit would have been. I blinked hard and looked again. Nothing, just empty space and broken masonry. My training kicked in then. Look for the rational explanation first. Dr. Morrison was missing, and missing people don't just vanish into thin air. I needed to search the area thoroughly, starting with the church itself. The front door had long since rotted away, leaving an empty frame overgrown with poison ivy. I pushed through carefully and stepped inside. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dead leaves and debris, but I could see the outline of where the pews used to be. At the far end, the altar area was clear except for that cracked stone altar and the circle of camera equipment. But what caught my attention was a section of floor near the back where the leaves had been disturbed. Something heavy had been dragged across it recently. I followed the drag marks to a wooden door set into the floor, a cellar entrance. The wood was old but solid, and there was a new brass padlock holding it shut. Someone had been down there recently. That's when I heard Dr. Morrison screaming. The sound came from below, muffled but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, calling for help. I grabbed a rock and smashed the padlock, yanked the door open, and found myself staring down into complete darkness. The smell that came up from below was like nothing I'd ever encountered, sweet and rotten at the same time, with an undertone of sulfur that made my eyes water. But Dr. Morrison was down there, and she needed help. I had a flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam seemed weak, swallowed up by the darkness below. The wooden stairs looked sturdy enough, though they creaked something awful under my weight. With each step down, the smell got stronger. The basement was bigger than I'd expected. Much bigger. It stretched back under the church and beyond, disappearing into shadows my flashlight couldn't reach. The walls were rough stone, and they were covered with symbols. Not carved, burned. Burned right into the rock like someone had taken a branding iron to them. Dr. Morrison was at the far end, slumped against the wall with her hands tied behind her back. She was conscious but barely, her eyes unfocused and glassy. As I got closer, I could see bite marks on her arms, small ones, like from a baby snake. "Dr. Morrison?" I knelt beside her and started working on the ropes. "Can you hear me?" She looked at me then, and her eyes cleared for just a moment. "Too late," she whispered. I brought it back. "It's awake now." That's when I heard the rattling. The sound started soft, like dried beans in a jar, but it was coming from all around us. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet seemed to vibrate with it. I got Dr. Morrison's hands free and helped her to her feet, but she could barely stand. "We have to get out of here," I said, putting her arm over my shoulder. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly, and we started toward the stairs. But as we got closer, the rattling got louder, angrier, and I could see them now. Snakes emerging from cracks in the walls, dozens of them, all sizes. Timber rattlers thick as my wrist. little pygmy rattlers no bigger than pencils, and species I'd never seen before with patterns that seemed to shift and move in my flashlight beam. They weren't just emerging randomly. They were positioning themselves between us and the stairs. "This isn't natural behavior," I said, more to myself than to Dr. Morrison. "Snakes don't coordinate like this." "Nothing natural about it," she mumbled. "I read the preacher's journal. He wasn't just handling serpents for faith. He was trying to summon their master." A king snake, 6 feet long and thick as a fence post, slithered down from the ceiling and landed right in front of the stairs. It reared up, swaying back and forth, but its eyes looked human, intelligent, like it was studying us. I pulled out my pistol, a .38 revolver I'd carried since the war. "Stay behind me." The first shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. The bullet hit the king snake center mass and passed right through, but instead of blood, something dark and oily leaked out. The snake didn't even flinch. If anything, it seemed amused. More snakes were coming now, pouring out of every crack and crevice. The rattling was so loud I could feel it in my bones. Dr. Morrison was getting heavier on my arm, and her breathing was getting shallow. The bite marks on her arms were turning black. "The antidote," she whispered, "in my bag upstairs. But it won't work on all of them." I looked around desperately for another way out, and that's when I saw it. At the very back of the cellar, where my flashlight beam barely reached, there was something moving, something big. A snake, but not like any snake that should exist. It had to be 30 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, coiled up in the deepest shadows. Its scales caught what little light there was and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And then it spoke, not hissed or made some snake noise. Spoke, in perfect, clear English, with the cadence of a preacher giving Sunday sermon. "Welcome to my congregation, brother," the voice said, echoing off the stone walls. "I've been waiting so long for visitors. Dr. Morrison here was kind enough to complete the summoning my previous servant began before his untimely death. Now I can offer you the same gift I offered him." The giant serpent uncoiled and began moving toward us, its head weaving back and forth. In the dim light, I could see its eyes clearly now. They were human eyes, the preacher's eyes, set in a snake's skull. "You're military trained," it continued, somehow knowing things it shouldn't know. "You've seen death. You know the value of power over life and death. Serve me, and I can give you that power. You'll never lose another person on your rescue missions. You'll be able to heal the dying with a touch." All around us, the smaller snakes had stopped moving. They were watching, waiting to see what I would do. Dr. Morrison's weight was almost too much now. She was barely conscious, her skin gray and cold despite the heat. Whatever venom was in her system was spreading fast. "What do you want?" I asked the thing. "What I've always wanted," it said, its voice now coming from all directions at once. "Worship, fear, the sweet corruption of faith turned to darkness. Your friend here tasted my gift when she completed the ritual. Soon she'll be like my other servants, alive but not alive, serving my will." I looked down at Dr. Morrison and saw that the black veins from her bite marks were spreading up her neck toward her face. Her eyes were starting to change, becoming cold and reptilian. That's when I remembered the little New Testament I still carried in my medical bag. The one my mother had given me before I shipped out. The one I'd kept through 2 years of war despite losing my faith. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was something else. But I pulled that little book out and held it up. The reaction was immediate. Every snake in the cellar recoiled like I'd pulled out a flamethrower. The giant serpent's voice became a hiss of pure rage. You dare bring that into my sanctuary? This is my sanctuary now, I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. And you're not welcome here. I started reading aloud, not even sure what passage I was looking at. But the words came anyway, words I'd memorized as a child and thought I'd forgotten. The 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The smaller snakes began writhing as if in pain, and several of them slithered back into their cracks. But the big one, the preacher thing, just laughed. Your faith is weak, little ranger. You stopped believing long ago. Those are just words now. And it was right. I was just reciting from memory, not feeling anything behind the words. The snakes started advancing again. But then I looked down at Dr. Morrison, saw what this thing had done to her, thought about all the people I'd saved over the years, all the times I'd pulled someone back from death through skill and determination and pure, stubborn refusal to give up. Maybe that was faith too. Maybe faith wasn't about believing in something you couldn't see. Maybe it was about believing in what you could do, what you were meant to do. I believe, I said, and this time I meant it. I believe in saving lives. I believe in standing between people and the things that want to hurt them. And I believe you're going back to hell where you belong. The little testament in my hands grew warm, and suddenly the cellar was full of light. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, brighter than my flashlight, but somehow easier on the eyes. It showed me things in that cellar I hadn't been able to see before. Bones scattered in the corners, human bones, picked clean and gnawed, symbols carved not just into the walls but into the ceiling and floor, forming patterns that made my head hurt to look at directly. And I could see the true size of the thing I was facing. The preacher serpent was even bigger than I'd thought, coiled back in recesses that stretched far beyond what should have fit under the church. Its scales weren't just reflecting light. They were absorbing it, drinking it in, and the creature itself seemed to pulse with a darkness that was more than just absence of light. Impossible, it hissed. But there was uncertainty in that voice now. You have no faith, no congregation, no power to draw upon. I have everything I need, I said, and I meant it. The light was coming from me now, from the testament in my hands, from something deep inside that I'd thought was dead but had just been sleeping. Dr. Morrison stirred in my arms. The black veins that had been spreading up her neck were starting to fade. Sam? She whispered. I'm here, I told her. We're getting out. I started walking toward the stairs, carrying her, the light moving with us. The smaller snakes scattered before us like shadows before sunrise. But the big one, the preacher thing, wasn't done. You think you've won? It roared, its voice shaking stones from the ceiling. I've had servants before, servants who brought me sacrifices, who fed my hunger. And when they outlived their usefulness, I consumed them too. The preacher thought he was summoning a divine spirit to serve his congregation. Instead, he fed his congregation to me, one by one, until only he remained. And then I took him too. The giant snake was moving now, uncoiling, itself from the depths, its head weaving closer. This is my place of power. These mountains, these valleys, the old places where faith turned to fear, they all belong to me now. You cannot banish what has taken root. We reached the stairs, and I started climbing. Dr. Morrison's weight manageable now that strength was flowing back into my arms. But behind us, I could hear the creature following, its massive body scraping against stone. You want to save people? It called after us. Serve me, and you'll never lose another soul. Refuse, and everyone you try to rescue from now on will die. Every hiker, every lost child, every injured climber, their deaths will be on your head. I paused at the top of the stairs, looking back into that pit of darkness. For a moment, I almost believed it, almost considered that maybe the easy way, the practical way, would be to make some kind of deal. Then I remembered every person I'd saved over the years, remembered why I'd become a ranger in the first place, not for power or glory, but because someone had to stand between the lost and the wilderness that wanted to claim them. No deal, I said. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't win. I slammed the cellar door shut and dragged a broken beam across it. That wouldn't hold the thing long, but it didn't have to. I had other plans. Dr. Morrison was getting stronger, able to walk on her own now. Her camera gear was still arranged around the altar, and I remembered what she'd written in her journal about the original summoning being interrupted. The fire, I said. In 1934, the church caught fire during the ritual. That's what trapped it down there. She nodded weakly. The preacher was trying to bring it fully into this world. The fire broke the circle, trapped it between dimensions. But when I found his journal, when I used his words to complete the summoning, you gave it a way back. The cellar door was starting to bulge upward as something massive pressed against it from below. We didn't have much time. I ran to my Jeep and grabbed the emergency road flares from my kit, plus the 5-gallon jerry can of gasoline I always carried. If fire had stopped this thing before, maybe fire could stop it again. Get to the Jeep, I told Dr. Morrison. Start her up and be ready to drive. The door exploded outward just as I was pouring the last of the gasoline around the altar. Broken wood and stone scattered across the church floor, and the smell of sulfur and decay rolled up from the cellar like fog. The preacher serpent's head emerged first, those human eyes blazing with rage. You cannot destroy what has already died once. I am beyond your small human concepts of life and death. Maybe, I said, pulling the pin from a road flare. But you're not beyond fire. I dropped the flare into the gasoline and dove for the door as the church erupted in flames behind me. The screaming started the moment the fire touched the altar. Not a snake's hiss or a human scream, but something between the two, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. I ran for the Jeep as the flames spread, Dr. Morrison already behind the wheel with the engine running. We made it about 100 yards before the whole church collapsed. The roof timbers, weakened by 20 years of weather, couldn't handle the heat. They came down like dominoes, trapping the fire inside, containing it. The screaming stopped. Dr. Morrison drove us back to town in silence. I spent the ride watching the smoke column in my rearview mirror, making sure it didn't spread to the surrounding forest. It didn't. The fire burned hot and fast and clean, consuming everything in that little hollow before burning itself out. The official report listed it as an accidental forest fire caused by a discarded cigarette. Dr. Morrison's disappearance was explained as getting lost and suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration, which caused hallucinations. The bite marks on her arms were attributed to aggressive snakes that were more active than usual due to the heat wave. Nobody questioned my story. Nobody wanted to. Dr. Morrison recovered fully, though she never finished her research project. She went back to whatever university she came from and never returned to West Virginia. I got a letter from her 6 months later, thanking me and saying she'd decided to focus her studies on less dangerous subjects. I stayed on as a ranger for another 15 years, until my retirement in 1971. I saved 43 more lives in that time, bringing my total to 66 rescues. Not bad for a man who'd lost his faith and found it again in the worst possible place. But I never went back to Serpent Hollow. None of us did. The State Forest Service permanently closed that section of the park after the fire, citing unstable terrain and fire danger. They put up signs warning people to stay away, and for the most part, people listened. For the most part. Every few years, I'd get reports of unusual snake activity in that area. Always during summer revivals at the local churches, always when religious fervor was running high in the surrounding communities. Hikers would report seeing snakes where they shouldn't be, moving in ways they shouldn't move. A few times people went missing near the old hollow, though they always turned up eventually, usually with no memory of where they'd been. I retired to a cabin on the other side of the mountain, close enough to help if needed, far enough away to sleep peacefully. But even now, 20 years later, I keep that little New Testament on my bedside table. And when storm clouds gather over Peter's Mountain, when the air gets thick and heavy like it did that August in 1956, I make sure to say a prayer or two, because some doors, once opened, never really close completely. They just wait for the next person foolish enough to knock. The church in Serpent Hollow is gone now, burned to ash and overgrown with new forest. But sometimes, on nights when the wind is still and the moon is dark, local folks say they can hear singing coming from that direction. Gospel music, the old kind. Shall we gather at the river? I tell them it's just the wind in the trees, an old man's imagination. But I know better. Some things don't die easy, and some places hold on to their darkness long after the light burns out. If you ever find yourself hiking in Jefferson National Forest, stick to the marked trails. Don't go looking for abandoned churches or forgotten communities. And if you hear singing coming from empty buildings, turn around and walk the other way. Trust me on this. Some doors should stay closed. Some beasts should stay buried. But they don't always stay that way. My name is Mary Catherine Ironwood, but everyone called me Cat. I worked as a ranger in George Washington National Forest for 9 years, and I need to tell you about something that happened back in 1971, something that made me quit working with children forever. I was 32 then, one of the first female rangers in Virginia. Had to fight tooth and nail for that job, proving myself over and over again. The other rangers finally accepted me after I'd led more than 200 educational groups through the wilderness without a single accident. Kids loved me, and I loved working with them. Used to be an elementary teacher before I became a ranger, so I knew how to keep children safe and happy in the woods. My specialty was the environmental education program. I'd take groups of kids on overnight camping trips, teach them about nature, show them how to respect the forest. Parents trusted me completely. I had wilderness first aid training, knew every safety protocol by heart, and carried emergency equipment everywhere I went. The area I worked was called Copperhead Ridge, way up on Massanutten Mountain. Beautiful place, but remote as hell. 6 miles from the visitor center, with radio coverage so spotty you might go hours without being able to call for help. The trails were steep and rocky, winding through old-growth forest that felt like it had been there since the beginning of time. What most people didn't know was the history of that ridge. Back in the 1890s, there had been an iron mine up there. The mining company used child workers, kids as young as 8 years old, working in dangerous conditions for pennies a day. In 1893, there was a terrible accident. A cave-in killed 12 children, ages 8 to 14. Their bodies were never recovered. The locals avoided Copperhead Ridge after that. Oh, they'd make up reasons. Said the trails were too dangerous, or the hunting wasn't good. But I knew it was really because of what happened to those children. Appalachian people have long memories for tragedy. I never believed in ghost stories. Missing children were always runaways or family problems, nothing supernatural about it. When parents mentioned their kids talking to invisible friends on the trails, I just figured children have active imaginations. Spending time in the deep woods makes anyone feel like they're not alone. It was mid-October when everything changed. The leaves were turning brilliant red and gold, and there was frost in the mornings. Perfect weather for camping, even though the days were getting shorter. I was leading a group of 15 kids, all around 10 to 12 years old, on a 2-day overnight trip. These weren't city kids either. They came from small towns around the forest, families who knew the outdoors. Smart, well-behaved children who followed instructions and stayed with the group. I remember thinking this would be one of my easiest trips yet. We hiked up to Copperhead Ridge in the afternoon, setting up base camp about a quarter mile from the old mine entrance. I'd been camping in that spot for years. It had good water access, level ground, and was far enough from the mine to be safe. The Park Service had sealed the mine entrance with steel grates back in the 60s, but I still made sure to warn the kids about staying away from that area. That first evening, something felt different. The children were unusually quiet and well-behaved. Normally, a group of kids camping would be loud and energetic, running around, laughing, playing games. These kids just sat calmly by the fire, barely talking above whispers. When I did my evening head count, something strange happened. I counted 18 children instead of 15. But when I counted again, going around the circle and pointing to each kid individually, there were only 15. I figured I'd miscounted the first time. Maybe some shadows from the fire had confused me. But it kept happening. Every time I did a group count, I got 18. Every time I counted individuals, I got 15. The temperature dropped that night, much more than the weather forecast had predicted. When I checked my thermometer near the sealed mine entrance, it read 20 degrees colder than at our campsite, just a few hundred yards away. My radio started picking up strange interference too. Children's voices singing songs I'd never heard before, in a language I couldn't identify. I told myself it was all perfectly normal. Counting errors because kids move around. Cold air settles in low places like mine shafts. Radio interference from all the metal ore in the mountain. But deep down, I was starting to feel that something was very, very wrong. The second day started normally enough. I got the kids up early, cooked breakfast over the camp stove, and went through my usual safety check. Everyone was present and accounted for. All 15 children lined up and ready for our nature hike. We spent the morning learning about local wildlife and forest ecology. The kids were engaged, but still unusually quiet. They kept glancing toward the mine area, even though I'd specifically told them it was off limits. A couple of times I caught them whispering among themselves and pointing in that direction. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near a creek about half a mile from camp. I was handing out sandwiches when one of the kids, a girl named Sarah, tugged on my sleeve. "Miss Cat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are those other kids?" I looked where she was pointing. Just 3 children from our group, sitting on a fallen log eating their lunch. "Those are Tommy, Jessica, and Michael from our group, honey." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "The ones next to them, the ones in the old-fashioned clothes." I looked again, still just saw Tommy, Jessica, and Michael. But Sarah was staring intently, like she could see something I couldn't. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tommy, Jessica, and Michael were sharing their food. They'd break off pieces of their sandwiches and set them down on the log beside them. like they were feeding someone. Then they'd wait a moment and smile, as if someone had said thank you. "Are you three playing pretend?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Tommy looked up at me with the most serious expression I'd ever seen on a 10-year-old's face. "We're not pretending, Miss Cat. They're hungry. They haven't eaten in a really long time." My training kicked in. When children start seeing things that aren't there, it could be a sign of medical problems, dehydration, or psychological stress. I checked Tommy's temperature. Normal. Asked if he felt dizzy or sick. He said no. He seemed perfectly healthy and alert. But he kept breaking off pieces of his sandwich and placing them carefully on the log. During the afternoon hike, more children started talking about the other kids. They described 3 children in work clothes that looked old-fashioned: overalls, heavy boots, cloth caps, the kind of clothes kids might have worn working in a mine over a century ago. I radioed back to the ranger station, but all I got was static mixed with what sounded like children singing. The voices were clear enough that I could almost make out the words, but they were in a dialect I didn't recognize. By dinner time, half the group was interacting with these invisible children. They'd save portions of their food, carry on conversations with empty air, and play games that seemed to involve people I couldn't see. They'd throw a ball to someone who wasn't there, then run to catch it when it came rolling back from the wrong direction. The worst part was how natural it all seemed to them. These weren't children pretending or playing make-believe. They acted like they were genuinely interacting with other kids who just happened to be invisible to me. After dinner, I did my evening head count again. 18 children. Always 18 when I counted the group, 15 when I counted individuals. That night, I barely slept. I could hear children laughing and playing outside our tents, but when I'd shine my flashlight toward the sounds, there would be nothing there. The laughter had an echoing quality to it, like it was coming from underground. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my tent. Small footsteps like children walking around the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. 3 of my kids, Sarah, Tommy, and a boy named David, were standing at the edge of camp in their pajamas, staring toward the mine entrance. "Hey," I called out, scrambling out of my sleeping bag. "What are you doing out here?" They turned to look at me with blank, dreamy expressions. "They called us," Sarah said simply. "They want us to come play." I herded them back to their tents, but I could see they didn't want to go. They kept looking over their shoulders toward the mine, like someone was calling their names. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting outside my tent with my flashlight, making sure none of the children wandered off again. When dawn came, I was exhausted and rattled. I'd been a ranger for 9 years and had never experienced anything like this. I considered calling for backup, but what would I say? That my kids were playing with invisible friends, that I kept miscounting them. I was starting to think I was losing my mind. But then I found the toys. Small, old-fashioned toys scattered around the mine entrance. A wooden top, carved so skillfully it must have taken hours to make. A rag doll with button eyes, and a dress that looked like it was sewn by hand. A set of marbles made from real clay, not the glass ones kids play with today. These toys looked like they were from the 1890s. They looked exactly like the kind of toys children might have played with while their parents worked in the mine, and they were covered in coal dust. I radioed for backup that morning, and thank God, Dave Hartwell was close enough to hike up to our camp by noon. Dave was a good ranger, experienced and level-headed. If anyone could help me figure out what was happening, it would be him. When Dave arrived, I quickly explained the situation. He listened without judgment, took notes, and started his own observations. Within an hour, he confirmed the head count problem. He was getting 18 children when counting the group, 15 when counting individually. "That's impossible," he said, scratching his head. "But I've done it 5 times now, and I keep getting the same result." Dave also heard the children's laughter coming from the sealed mine entrance. We walked over there together with our flashlights, even though it was broad daylight. The steel grates were still firmly in place, rusted shut and covered with decades of leaves and debris. No way anyone could have gotten inside. But we could clearly hear children playing somewhere beyond those grates. Laughter, running footsteps, the sound of voices calling out in some kind of game. "Hello?" Dave called out. "Is someone in there?" The sounds stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then, after about 30 seconds, we heard a small voice call back. "Please come play with us. We're so lonely." Dave and I looked at each other. His face had gone pale. "That voice," he whispered. It sounded like it came from really far underground. We headed back to camp to discuss what to do. But when we got there, we found a group of our kids standing in a circle, holding hands with empty spaces between them. They were singing a song I'd never heard before, in that same strange dialect I'd been picking up on the radio. "What song is that?" I asked Sarah. "The other children taught it to us," she said. "It's about working in the dark places under the ground. They said their mommies and daddies made them work there before the rocks fell down." My blood ran cold. These children somehow knew about the mine accident from 1893. Dave pulled me aside. "I found something you need to see," he said, holding up a manila folder. "I stopped by the Historical Society on my way here and asked about this area. Look at this." The folder contained newspaper clippings and incident reports dating back decades. In 1923, 3 children from a school group had disappeared while camping near Copperhead Ridge. Their bodies were found a week later at the bottom of an old mine shaft that had supposedly been sealed. In 1934, 3 more children vanished during a church retreat, found dead in the same mine shaft. In 1955, 3 children from a Boy Scout troop, same mine shaft, same mysterious circumstances. Every 20 years or so, exactly 3 children would die on Copperhead Ridge. The reports mentioned that other children in the groups had talked about invisible playmates before the disappearances. "We need to get these kids out of here," Dave said. "Today." I agreed completely, but when we tried to pack up camp, the children resisted. They didn't want to leave. They kept saying their new friends would be sad if they went away. That's when things got really scary. As we were loading gear into backpacks, I saw something that made me drop my water bottle. One of my kids, a quiet boy named Michael, was sitting on a log talking to empty air. But there was an impression in the leaves beside him, like someone else was sitting there. An invisible someone with small feet and light weight. I watched as Michael shared his trail mix with this invisible companion. He'd pour some into his palm, then tip his hand toward the empty space. The trail mix would disappear, piece by piece, like invisible fingers were picking it up. "Michael," I said carefully, "can you see who you're sharing your food with?" He looked up at me with the most serious expression. "His name is Billy. He's 8 years old, and he's been waiting here since the rocks fell down. He's really hungry, Miss Cat. He says he hasn't eaten anything good in a very long time." Then Michael tilted his head, like he was listening to something. "He wants to know if we can stay and play forever. He says it gets lonely under the ground." Dave and I tried to establish a perimeter around the mine entrance, using rope to mark off a safety zone. But the children kept being drawn to that area. We'd turn our backs for 5 minutes and find 3 or 4 kids standing right at the edge of our rope barrier, staring into the darkness beyond the rusted grates. The temperature around the mine kept dropping, even though it was a warm October afternoon. Our breath started showing as vapor when we got within 50 feet of the entrance. That evening, as we were cooking dinner, Dave grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered. In the flickering firelight, I could see small shadows moving around our campsite. Child-sized shadows that didn't match any of our kids. The shadows would move independently, sometimes waving at our children, sometimes pointing toward the mine. Our kids waved back and pointed in response like they were having full conversations with whatever was casting those shadows. I tried to rationalize it. Tricks of the light, shadows from the fire, my tired mind seeing things that weren't there. But then I heard Dave gasp. One of our kids, little Sarah, was playing catch with someone I couldn't see. She'd throw her ball toward an empty spot near the mine entrance, and it would come flying back from a completely different direction. Not bouncing off rocks or trees. Someone was catching it and throwing it back. As I watched, the ball floated in midair for a moment before flying back to Sarah's hands. That's when I knew we were dealing with something far beyond my training as a forest ranger. Something was very wrong on Copperhead Ridge, and our children were in terrible danger. Around midnight, I woke up to find half our kids missing from their tents. Dave and I grabbed our flashlights and ran through the campsite, counting heads. 7 children were still in their sleeping bags. 8 were gone. We found them standing in front of the mine entrance, still in their pajamas, their hands pressed against the rusted steel grates. They weren't trying to get through. They were just standing there, perfectly still, like they were listening to something. "Kids," I called out, "get away from there right now." They turned to look at us, but their eyes were strange, distant and dreamy, like they were sleepwalking. "They're calling us," Tommy said in a flat voice. "They want us to come down and play. They say it's fun in the dark." That's when I saw them. 3 children standing just behind the grates, inside the sealed mine. They looked solid and real, but their clothes were from another time. Work overalls, heavy boots, cloth caps covered in coal dust. Their faces were pale and smudged with dirt, and their eyes reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's. They were beckoning to our kids, gesturing for them to come closer. "Please," one of the ghost children said, his voice echoing from deep underground. "We've been alone for so long. Stay and play with us forever." The living children started reaching through the gaps in the grates, trying to touch the spirits. "No!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back. "Everyone get away from there." But the ghost children weren't giving up. As I watched in horror, the rusted grates started to bend and buckle, like invisible hands were pulling them apart from the inside. "They're opening it," Dave said, his voice shaking. "How are they opening it?" The mine entrance, sealed for decades, was slowly coming open. Dave and I managed to get our kids back to camp, but they fought us every step of the way. They cried and begged to go back, saying their friends needed them. I used my child psychology training to try to understand what was happening. These ghost children had died in a terrible accident over a century ago. They were lonely, afraid, and desperate for companionship. They didn't understand that they were dead or that the mine was dangerous. All they knew was that living children visited the ridge every 20 years or so, and they could convince 3 of them to stay forever. "We have to get out of here," Dave said. "First light, we pack up and hike down to the parking lot." I agreed, but I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The ghost children had found living playmates, and they weren't going to let them go easily. Around 3 in the morning, we heard children singing again. The same song our kids had learned, about working in dark places underground. But this time, the voices were coming from our own camp. All 15 of our living children were standing outside their tents, singing along with voices we couldn't see. Their eyes were glazed over, like they were hypnotized. As they sang, they started walking toward the mine. Dave and I ran after them, but it was like trying to stop sleepwalkers. The children moved with single-minded purpose, ignoring our shouts and commands. When we reached the mine entrance, the grates were completely torn away. The opening yawned black and empty, like a mouth waiting to swallow our kids whole. The 3 ghost children stood just inside the entrance, no longer bothering to hide. They were holding hands and singing, their voices harmonizing with our living children in an eerie chorus. "Come down and play," they called. "Come down where it's always dark and quiet. Come down where we can be together forever." Our kids started walking into the mine. I didn't think, I just acted. I ran ahead of the group and stood in the mine entrance, blocking the way. "Stop," I shouted, not to the living children, but to the dead ones. "These children can't stay here." The ghost children looked at me with surprise, like they hadn't expected an adult to see them. "Why not?" asked the one who looked about 10 years old. "We're so lonely. Nobody ever comes to play with us anymore. They'll be happy here. We'll take good care of them." "You're scaring them," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle but firm. "Look at them. They're not really awake. This isn't how children should play." The ghost children looked confused. They turned to stare at our living kids, who were standing with blank expressions and glassy eyes. "We don't mean to hurt them," the youngest spirit said. "We just want friends. We've been alone in the dark for so long." My heart broke for these lost children, but I couldn't let them take the living ones. "I know you're lonely," I said. "I know what happened to you was terrible and unfair. But these children have families who love them. They have lives to live. You can't keep them." "But who will play with us?" the oldest ghost child asked, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "I'll remember you," I said. "I'll make sure people know what happened here. You won't be forgotten anymore." The ghost children looked at each other, then back at me. "Promise?" the smallest one whispered. "I promise." The spirits began to fade, becoming translucent in the moonlight. As they disappeared, our living children blinked and looked around in confusion, like they were waking up from a deep sleep. Behind us, I heard a rumbling sound. The mine entrance was collapsing, sealing itself permanently with tons of rock and earth. When the dust settled, there was no trace that there had ever been an opening there at all. We hiked down from Copperhead Ridge the next morning. The children remembered very little about what had happened, just fragments of dreams about playing with other kids in old-fashioned clothes. I filed an official incident report that mentioned unstable mine structures and recommended the area be permanently closed for safety reasons. I didn't mention the supernatural elements. Who would have believed me? But I couldn't forget those 3 lonely spirits who had waited over a century for playmates. I researched the 1893 mine accident and learned the names of the children who had died. Billy Morrison, age 8. Thomas Fletcher, age 10. Mary Sullivan, age 9. I convinced the Park Service to install a memorial plaque near the former mine site. It reads, "In memory of the children who lost their lives in the Copperhead Ridge mining accident of 1893. They are not forgotten." I transferred to desk duty after that trip and never led children's groups again. I told my supervisors I wanted to focus on administrative work, but the truth was that I couldn't bear the responsibility. What if it happened again? What if next time I wasn't able to save them? Dave retired early and moved to Florida. He said he needed to live somewhere with lots of sunshine and no mountains. We stay in touch, but we never talk about what happened on the ridge. Other rangers started reporting similar incidents at historical sites throughout the Appalachians, places where children had died in mining accidents, factory fires, or industrial disasters. Always the same pattern. Visiting children would start talking to invisible playmates, and sometimes 3 would disappear. The Park Service quietly established new protocols for educational programs. No overnight camping near sites of historical tragedies involving children. Mandatory buddy systems. More frequent radio check-ins. They didn't put it in writing, but the message was clear. Some places in these old mountains hold on to their dead, and children are especially vulnerable. I'm retired now, living in a small town in the valley. I keep the memorial plaque clean and leave flowers there sometimes. Wild flowers that kids might have picked back in 1893. Sometimes I think about those 3 ghost children and wonder if they finally found peace. I hope they did. I hope they're not still waiting in the darkness under the mountain, calling out to every group of children who pass by. But I wouldn't recommend camping on Copperhead Ridge, just the same. And if you're ever leading a group of kids in the wilderness, make sure you count them carefully. Count them twice, because sometimes you might find you have more children than you started with, and that's when you need to worry. My name is Franklin Ridgewater, but everyone calls me Frank. I've been working the Blue Ridge Parkway for 18 years now, and my family's been taking care of these mountains even longer. My grandfather helped build the original roads back in the 1930s, and my father worked maintenance until his back gave out. I guess you could say the mountains are in my blood. It was November 1989, and I was 45 years old with a perfect safety record. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never lost anyone on my watch. I'd pulled 67 people out of weather emergencies, helped with heart attacks, talked jumpers off the cliffs, and guided lost hikers back to safety. The mountains could be dangerous, sure, but they were fair if you knew what you were doing. The section I worked was called Devil's Backbone, a 20-mile stretch of winding road that carved along Wintergreen Mountains Ridge. Folks always asked about the name, and I'd tell them the same thing. It got called that because the ridge looks like a giant spine when you see it from below. Nothing spooky about it, just geography. But the locals had their stories. They'd whisper about Cherokee spirits and protective ghosts, especially after a few drinks at Murphy's Bar in town. I never paid much attention to that talk. I'm a practical man. When bad things happened on Devil's Backbone, and they did happen more than other places, I blamed ice, fog, drunk drivers, or people driving too fast for conditions. Mountains don't care about your schedule, and they'll kill you quick if you don't respect them. My truck was a 1985 Ford Ranger, nothing fancy but reliable. I kept it loaded with tire chains, emergency medical supplies, road salt, flares, and a CB radio that could reach dispatch on good days. The radio was important because cell phones weren't much use up here, and the nearest hospital was an hour away, even in perfect weather. That November night started like any other emergency call. Ice storm warnings had been going out all day, and by 6 o'clock the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in an hour. That's when you know trouble's coming. Ice was already forming on the road surface, turning the asphalt into a skating rink. The call came in at 7:30 p.m. A family was stranded somewhere along Devil's Backbone. 2 adults and a baby, stuck in their car with some kind of medical emergency. The details were fuzzy because their call kept cutting out, but dispatch caught enough to know they needed help fast. I loaded up my truck, put on the tire chains, and headed out into the storm. The wind was already howling through the trees, and ice was clicking against my windshield like angry fingers tapping. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed 22 degrees and dropping. "Unit 47 to dispatch," I called on the radio. "Heading up Devil's Backbone now. Weather's getting nasty out here." Static crackled back at me. "Copy that, Frank. Be careful up there." We lost contact with the family about 20 minutes ago. That should have been my first warning that something was different about this night. In 18 years, I'd never had a routine rescue call on Devil's Backbone, but I figured it was just the storm making everything harder than usual. As I drove up the mountain road, my headlights cut through the darkness, showing ice building up on the guardrails and tree branches. The road was getting slick despite my chains, and I had to gear down to keep from sliding. The wind pushed against my truck like it was trying to shove me off the road. About halfway up the mountain, something made me slow down. There was a stillness in the air that felt wrong, like the moment before lightning strikes. The hair on my arms stood up, and my compass started spinning slowly in circles. I figured it was just the storm messing with the magnetic field, but it made me uneasy. Then I heard something on the radio that made my blood run cold. Instead of dispatch's voice, I heard what sounded like singing in a language I didn't recognize. It was beautiful and sad, like a lullaby for the dead. The melody seemed to wrap around my truck, and for a moment, I forgot I was driving. I shook my head and turned the radio off. Storm interference, that's all it was. Had to be. But as I drove deeper into Devil's Backbone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark spaces between the trees. The ice was getting worse with every mile. Even with chains, my truck slipped and slid like it was fighting me. I'd driven this road thousands of times, but tonight it felt different. Unfamiliar somehow, like the curves weren't where they should be. I'd been searching for the stranded family for over an hour when I finally saw taillights through the storm. But when I got closer, my heart nearly stopped. The car wasn't just stuck, it was hanging over the edge of a cliff, held up by what looked like a wall of ice that had formed against the guardrail. That ice formation shouldn't have existed. I'd seen plenty of winter storms, and ice doesn't build up that way. It was too thick, too solid, and it was holding the weight of an entire car like it was made of concrete. I parked my truck and grabbed my emergency gear. The wind was howling so loud I could barely think, and the cold cut through my jacket like knives. As I got closer to the car, I could hear crying inside, a woman's voice and the high-pitched wail of a baby. "Help us!" the woman shouted when she saw my flashlight. "Please, our baby's sick. She's so cold." I looked at the situation and felt my stomach drop. The car was balanced on maybe 6 inches of ice. One wrong move, one crack in that formation, and the whole family would go over the edge. It was a 100-foot drop to the rocks below. "Stay calm," I called out. "Don't move around in there. I'm going to get you out." But how? I couldn't hook a tow line to the car without risking the ice breaking. I couldn't safely get close enough to the doors. And even if I could get them out, the baby was turning blue from the cold. She needed a hospital, not a long ride down a mountain in my truck. That's when I saw him. At first I thought it was just a shadow moving between the trees. But shadows don't walk upright, and they don't wear clothes. This figure was tall and dressed in what looked like traditional Native American clothing. Leather and fur and feathers that should have been soaked through in the storm, but somehow weren't. The figure stepped out of the tree line about 50 feet away from the car. He was an older man with long gray hair and dark skin, and he was looking right at me. The weird thing was, the wind and ice didn't seem to touch him at all. He stood there perfectly still, like he was in a different world from the rest of us. "Hey," I called out. "You can't be up here. It's dangerous." The man didn't answer with words, but suddenly I heard a voice in my head, as clear as if someone was standing next to me. "The child will die if you do not listen." I staggered backward, sure I was losing my mind. People don't talk inside your head. That's not how the world works. But even as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, the voice came again. "There is a path down the cliff face. 30 feet to your left. Follow the stones." I looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but darkness and storm. But then, as if my eyes were adjusting to a different kind of light, I started to make out shapes in the ice. There were stones, big, flat rocks that seemed to be arranged in a rough stairway down the cliff. They were covered in ice, but not the slick kind. This ice had texture, like it was meant to be walked on. "This is crazy," I muttered. But the baby's crying was getting weaker, and I knew she was running out of time. The figure nodded toward the car, and somehow I understood what he wanted me to do. Get the family out, take them down the stone path, trust that it would hold. "My people have walked these mountains for 1,000 years," the voice said in my mind. "We know the safe paths." I wanted to radio for backup, but when I tried the CB, all I got was that same strange singing. The needle on my compass was spinning like a pinwheel. None of my equipment was working right. The baby's crying stopped. That sound, or lack of it, made my decision for me. I didn't care if I was losing my mind or talking to a ghost or having some kind of breakdown. That little girl was dying, and if this stranger knew a way to save her, I was going to take it. I approached the car carefully, testing each step. The ice formation held my weight, but I could feel it creaking underneath me. "I'm going to get you out," I told the family through the window. "But we have to move fast and careful." The father was maybe 30, scared out of his mind. The equal mother was younger, holding a baby that was way too quiet and still. "She won't wake up," the mother whispered. "I can't get her to wake up. Hypothermia." The baby was shutting down. I managed to get the car door open without shifting the ice too much. "We're going to climb down the cliff," I told them. "I know it sounds insane, but it's the only way." "Down the cliff?" the father said. "Are you crazy? We'll fall." I looked back at the figure in the trees. He was still there, still watching, and somehow his presence made me feel calmer. "Trust me," I said. "I've been working these mountains for 18 years. I know what I'm doing." That was a lie. I had no idea what I was doing. But sometimes when people are dying, you have to act on faith. Getting the family out of the car was like defusing a bomb. Every movement made the ice groan and shift. I had to reach in and lift the baby out first. She was so small and cold, like holding a little frozen bird. Her lips were blue, and her breathing was shallow. "Come on, sweetheart," I whispered. "Stay with us." The mother came next, then the father. The whole time that ice wall held us up like it was reinforced with steel. But I knew it couldn't last forever. Ice doesn't work that way, no matter how thick it gets. As soon as we were all out, I led them toward where the figure had pointed. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see the stone path clearly now. The rocks were old, really old, and they were arranged too perfectly to be natural. Someone had built this stairway a long time ago. "I don't see any path," the father said, panic in his voice. "There's nothing there but cliff." That's when I realized I might be the only one who could see it. The stones were visible to me, but to them, it probably looked like I was about to walk off a cliff. The figure in the trees, they probably couldn't see him either. "They will see when they take the first step," the voice said in my mind. The mountain will show them the way. You have to trust me, I told the family. I know it looks dangerous, but this is our only chance. Your daughter needs to get to a hospital now. The mother looked at her baby's pale face and made the decision for all of us. Okay, she said. Okay, we'll follow you. I stepped onto the first stone, holding the baby close to my chest. My boot found solid purchase on what should have been empty air. Behind me, I heard the mother gasp as the rock became visible under my feet. How is that possible? The father whispered. I didn't have an answer for him. I just kept moving, one stone at a time, down a cliff face that shouldn't have had any handholds at all. Each rock was wide enough for one person, and somehow they never felt slippery, despite the ice storm raging around us. As we climbed down, I started to notice other things that didn't make sense. The wind wasn't hitting us as hard as it should have. The temperature felt warmer near the stones. And sometimes, when I looked up or to the side, I caught glimpses of other figures moving through the trees. More people in traditional clothing, watching our progress. Cherokee warriors, I realized. The voice had said his people had walked these mountains for 1,000 years. This was Cherokee land, had been for generations before the white settlers came. The stories the locals told weren't just stories. They were memories. Halfway down the cliff, the baby started to cry again. It was a weak sound, but it was better than the terrible silence. The mother started crying too, but from relief this time. She's warming up, she said. How is she warming up? I looked around and realized she was right. Despite the storm, despite the wind and ice, the air around us was getting warmer. Not hot, but comfortable, like we were being protected by some kind of invisible shelter. When we reached the bottom of the cliff, I saw a sight that made me stop walking altogether. There was a road down here, not a modern paved road, but an old dirt track that wound through the valley. And sitting on that road was an ambulance, engine running, lights flashing. How did they know to come here? The father asked. I didn't answer because I was watching the ambulance crew. 2 paramedics were walking toward us, and they moved with the same strange calm as the figure I'd seen in the trees. Their faces were kind but serious, and when they reached us, they spoke in voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We've been waiting, one of them said, though that was impossible. No one had called them. No one knew where we were. They took the baby and started working on her immediately. Warm blankets, heated oxygen, all the things she needed. Within minutes, her color started coming back, and she was crying loud and healthy. While the paramedics worked, I looked back up at the cliff we'd just climbed down. In the storm and darkness, I couldn't see the stone path anymore. I couldn't even see how we'd gotten down here. The cliff face looked smooth and impossible to climb. Frank. The voice came from behind me, and this time it wasn't in my head. I turned around and saw the Cherokee warrior standing by the ambulance. He was solid now, real, and when he spoke, everyone could hear him. Thank you for trusting the old ways, he said. The child will live. The family stared at him in shock. The mother clutched her baby closer. Who are you? She whispered. I am a guardian of this place, he said simply. My people died defending these mountains. Our spirits remain to protect those who travel here. The father found his voice. Spirits? You mean you're dead? Yes, for more than 200 years. But death is not the end, especially when there is work still to be done. He walked over to me, and I could feel warmth radiating from him like he was standing next to a fire. Your family has always served these mountains well, Frank Ridgewater. Your grandfather knew of us. He would leave tobacco and whiskey by the old Cherokee markers. He understood the agreement. "What agreement?" I asked. "The mountains are dangerous. They take lives. But we can help. We can guide people to safety, warn them of hazards, provide shelter in storms. All we ask is respect, recognition. Remember that this land was ours first, and that we died protecting it." The storm was starting to clear, and I could see stars beginning to show through the clouds. The warrior looked up at them and smiled. "The danger has passed," he said, "for tonight." The ambulance was ready to leave, and the paramedics were loading the family inside. But as they prepared to go, the warrior stopped them. "The old road will take you safely to the hospital," he told the driver. "Follow the valley path, then turn left at the stone marker. You'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes was impossible. The hospital was an hour away by the main road, but the driver nodded like this made perfect sense, and the ambulance pulled away into the darkness. I stood there in the clearing, watching the taillights disappear, and suddenly felt very alone. "Will I see you again?" I asked the warrior. "Every time someone needs help on Devil's Backbone," he said. "Every time you remember to leave tobacco by the trail markers. Every time you tell people that these mountains are sacred, and the dead still watch over the living." Then he was gone, faded back into the trees like he'd never been there at all. I made it back to my truck just as the ice started melting. The storm had ended as suddenly as it began, and the temperature was rising fast. By the time I drove back to the ranger station, you could barely tell there had been a storm at all. But I couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't explain it to myself, let alone to anyone else. When dispatch asked for my report, I kept it simple. Found the family, got them to safety, emergency vehicles responded. I didn't mention Cherokee spirits or impossible ice formations or stone paths that appeared and disappeared. The next morning I called the hospital to check on the baby. She was fine, completely healthy, like she'd never been in any danger at all. The family had been released that same night. But when I asked about the ambulance crew that had picked them up, the hospital had no record of any emergency call from Devil's Backbone. "Our ambulances were all here last night," the dispatcher told me. "None of them went out to the mountains." That should have scared me, but it didn't. Instead, it made me curious. I started researching the history of Devil's Backbone, looking through old newspaper articles and county records. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about the mountains. In 1756, the last Cherokee village in this area was attacked by colonial militia. The warriors made their final stand on what was now called Devil's Backbone, trying to protect their families who were hiding in caves along the cliff face. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought anyway. Every single warrior died, but they bought enough time for most of their people to escape. The land was cursed after that, according to the old stories. Settlers who tried to farm it found their crops failing, their animals dying, their children getting lost in the woods. The road that was eventually built there claimed more lives than any other stretch of highway in Virginia. But some of the stories were different. Some talked about mysterious rescues, impossible survivals, people being guided to safety by figures that appeared and disappeared like smoke. The earliest account I could find was from 1892, when a stagecoach went over the side of the mountain and everyone should have died. But a traveling preacher wrote in his journal about dusky angels who carried the passengers to safety on invisible bridges made of moonlight. I started paying attention to the accident statistics for Devil's Backbone. Since I'd been working there, the death rate had been dropping year by year. Accidents still happened, but they were less severe. More people walked away from crashes that should have killed them. More lost hikers found their way back to the trail. I also started noticing things I'd missed before. Cherokee markers along the trail. Old stone cairns that I'd always assumed were put there by Park Service. Fresh tobacco left by the roadside, though I never saw who put it there. The faint smell of wood smoke on windless days. 2 weeks after the ice storm, I had another emergency call on Devil's Backbone. A teenage girl had fallen while rock climbing, broken her leg in 3 places. I found her at the bottom of a 30-foot cliff, but she was lying on a bed of pine needles and moss that had somehow cushioned her fall. She should have been dead, but she wasn't even unconscious. "The old man told me to lie still and wait for help," she said when I reached her. "He said you'd come." "What old man?" I asked, though I already knew. "The Cherokee guy in the traditional clothes. He's standing right there." She pointed to empty air, but I turned and saw him anyway. The same warrior who had saved the family in the ice storm. He nodded to me and faded back into the trees. That's when I understood. The Guardians weren't just showing themselves to me. They were helping everyone who came to Devil's Backbone in distress. They'd always been there, protecting travelers, preventing deaths when they could. But most people couldn't see them, couldn't hear them. They just experienced the miracles, the impossible survivals, the lucky breaks, the mysterious rescues. I was different because my family had always worked these mountains. My grandfather had known about the Guardians, had maintained the old agreements. The Cherokee spirits trusted the Ridgewater family to help them help others. The teenage girl recovered completely. The family from the ice storm sent me a thank you card with a picture of their baby, healthy and smiling. The accident rate on Devil's Backbone continued to drop. But I knew the real test was still coming. The Guardian had told me that death was not the end when there was work still to be done. I was 45 years old, and I'd been working dangerous mountain rescues for 18 years. My body was starting to feel the strain. Eventually, something would happen that I couldn't walk away from. I just hoped that when that time came, I'd be ready to join the protectors instead of the protected. 3 years have passed since that night on Devil's Backbone, and I've changed the way I do my job. I still respond to emergency calls, still pull people out of crashes, and guide lost hikers back to safety. But now I work with partners I can't always see. I leave tobacco by the old Cherokee markers every month. I've learned to recognize the signs when the Guardians are near, the sudden warmth in a cold place, the path that appears just when you need it, the voices on the wind that speak in Cherokee. I've started studying the language, trying to understand what they're saying. It's mostly warnings. Danger ahead, safe path here, storm coming. Other rangers have started asking questions. They've noticed that my rescue success rate is impossibly high, that people survive things on my sections of road that would kill them anywhere else. I tell them I've just learned to read the mountains better, which is true in a way. The Cherokee Tribal Council in town knows about me now. Elder Mary Swimmer came to the ranger station 6 months ago and thanked me for honoring the old agreements. She brought me a traditional tobacco pouch and taught me the proper way to make offerings. She also told me stories her grandmother had passed down. Stories about white families who worked with the Cherokee spirits to protect travelers on the mountain roads. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "He understood that some things are more important than the color of your skin. Some things are about respecting the land and the people who died for it." I asked her how many Guardians there were, and she smiled. "As many as needed. When someone dies protecting others, their spirit stays to keep protecting. That's the Cherokee way." The accidents on Devil's Backbone have dropped to almost nothing. Other sections of the parkway still see their share of crashes and fatalities, but my section has become the safest stretch of mountain road in Virginia. The state officials think it's due to improved maintenance and better warning signs. They're partly right. Last month I got a call that brought it all full circle. A family was stranded in a blizzard, parents and a baby, just like that night 3 years ago. But this time, when I arrived, the Cherokee Guardians were already there, visible and helping. The whole family could see them, and they weren't afraid. They told us to wait for the ranger with the tobacco pouch, the mother explained. They said you'd know what to do. I did know. I helped the family into my truck, drove them to safety, and made sure the baby was warm and healthy. It was routine by then, almost easy. The Guardians had prepared the way, just like they always do. As I write this, I'm 58 years old. My hair is gray, my knees creak when I climb, and I can feel the mountains calling me to a different kind of service. I'm training my replacement, a young Cherokee woman named Sarah who already knows about the Guardians, already speaks the language they use. When your time comes, she asked me recently, will you stay to help like they do? I think I will. These mountains have been my life, and the work is important. There are always travelers who need protection, always people who get lost or hurt in places where the old spirits still walk. The Guardians have been protecting this land for over 200 years. I'd be honored to join them. Sometimes late at night when I'm patrolling Devil's Backbone, I see them all together. Dozens of Cherokee warriors standing along the ridge watching over the road. They nod to me as I pass, and I nod back. We're all part of the same mission now, keeping people safe on dangerous ground, making sure that death doesn't claim anyone who can still be saved. The mountains remember everything, every tree that's fallen, every stream that's changed course, every person who's died trying to cross them. But they also remember every act of kindness, every moment when the living and the dead work together to preserve life. Devil's Backbone got its name from the shape of the ridge, just like I always told people. But now I know there's more to it than that. It's the backbone of something larger, a network of spirits and stories that stretches across all the Cherokee lands, binding the past to the present, and the dead to the living. If you ever drive through these mountains and see something that doesn't quite make sense, a path that wasn't there before, a warm place in a cold storm, figures moving through the trees, don't be afraid. Just remember that you're traveling through sacred ground, and that those who died protecting it are still watching over everyone who passes through. Leave some tobacco by the trail markers if you can. The Guardians appreciate the respect. And drive carefully on Devil's Backbone. There are spirits watching, but they can't save everyone. Some things still depend on human wisdom and human care. The mountains are beautiful, but they're not forgiving. The dead can guide you to safety, but the living have to choose to follow. My name is Margaret Thornfield, but everyone calls me Maggie. I've been a forest ranger for 16 years now, working the deep woods of Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. Most people think my job is just about preventing forest fires and helping lost hikers, but I also work with cultural resources. That means I study the old stories, the Cherokee history, all the folklore that makes these mountains special. I'm 44 years old, born and raised in these hills. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days, about Cherokee medicine women and mountain healers. She called them wise women, not witches. Men fear what they don't understand, she'd say. They called healers witches when they got scared of women who knew things. That's what I believed too. All those old witch trial stories from back in the 1700s. I figured they were just men punishing women who threatened their power. Women who knew about herbs and healing, who helped other women when the men couldn't. The whole witch thing was made up to scare people. I wish I still believed that. It was late October 1984 when everything changed. The leaves had mostly fallen, and we'd gotten our first snow earlier than usual. I was heading out to Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest, the really old section where some trees are over 400 years old. Cherokee shamans used to train in those ancient woods before white settlers came and changed everything. I was going because we'd gotten some strange reports. 3 different hikers in the past month had come back with weird stories. They'd gone into the deep woods for day hikes and somehow lost 3 hours and 33 minutes. Exactly. Every single time. The hikers all told similar stories. They'd met a woman in old-fashioned clothes who offered to make deals with them, trade something important for something they wanted more. When they refused or got scared, they'd suddenly find themselves back at the trailhead with no memory of how they got there. The other rangers figured it was just people getting lost and making up stories to cover their embarrassment. But something bothered me about it. All 3 hikers mentioned the same time loss. And when I checked their names against my genealogy research, I found something interesting. All 3 were descendants of families that lived here in the 1700s. That's when I remembered Sarah Whitethorn. I'd come across her story while researching local history for the Park Service. In 1778, right in the middle of the Revolutionary War, a young woman named Sarah had been accused of witchcraft. The local judge, a man named Ezekiel Thornfield, my own ancestor it turns out, had ordered her execution. The record said she'd learned heathen magic from Cherokee healers and was using it to curse good Christian folk. Before they killed her, Sarah had supposedly cursed the bloodlines of everyone who condemned her, said their descendants would pay for their sins. Then, they hanged her in a clearing deep in what's now the Memorial Forest. I'd always thought it was just another sad story of an innocent woman killed by scared, ignorant men. But now, with these hikers all being descendants of 1778 families, and my own name appearing in those old records, I needed to investigate. The morning I headed out, the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight. My breath made clouds as I packed my gear, camera, recording equipment, genealogy charts, and my grandmother's collection of Cherokee folklore books. I threw in a compass and GPS unit too, though I knew those woods better than my own backyard. The trail to the Memorial Forest is 14 miles from the nearest road. No cell towers, no radio contact once you get deep enough. Just you and trees that were old when America was born. As I hiked in, everything felt wrong somehow. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter. Even my footsteps seemed muffled. The silence felt heavy, like it was watching me. About halfway in, I noticed my compass needle starting to spin. Not just drift, actually spinning in slow circles. I checked my GPS, and it showed coordinates that couldn't be right. According to the device, I was somehow 30 miles south of where I actually stood. The temperature kept dropping too, even though the weather report had called for a warming trend. My breath got thicker and thicker until it looked like fog. And underneath the smell of snow and pine, I caught something else. Something that made my stomach twist. It smelled like burning herbs, like sage and other plants I couldn't identify, but stronger. Ancient, like someone was burning medicine bundles somewhere deeper in the woods. That's when I found the first piece of impossible evidence. Lying across the trail was a piece of torn cloth. Not modern fabric. This was rough homespun linen, dyed with what looked like natural indigo. The kind of cloth women made by hand in the 1700s. It looked fresh, like it had just been torn from someone's dress. I photographed it carefully and bagged it as evidence, even though evidence of what, I couldn't say. My hands shook a little as I worked, though I told myself it was just the cold. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. Trees I'd known for years looked different somehow. Older, more twisted, shadows fell in patterns that didn't match the sun, and that smell of burning herbs got stronger and stronger. By the time I reached the memorial forest, I knew I wasn't just investigating missing time anymore. I was walking into something that would change everything I thought I knew about the world. The memorial forest felt like stepping into a church, if churches were made of living wood and measured their age in centuries. The old growth trees towered over me, some wider than my pickup truck. Normally, I found peace in this place. Today, it felt like the trees were leaning in, listening. I was looking for the execution site mentioned in the historical records, but none of my maps showed it. According to the 1778 documents, Sarah Whitethorn had been hanged in a clearing where 3 ancient oaks stand guard. I'd been through this forest dozens of times and never seen anything matching that description. But now, following my spinning compass instead of the trails, I found myself on a path I'd never noticed before. It wound between the massive trunks like it had always been there, covered with leaves that looked too fresh for this late in the season. That's when I heard the singing. It was a woman's voice, soft and low, singing something in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not Cherokee, something older. The melody made my skin crawl, not because it was ugly, but because it was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous. I followed the sound, my camera ready, trying to be quiet. The singing got clearer as I got closer, and underneath it, I could hear something else, crackling, like a fire. The path opened into a circular clearing I'd never seen before. 3 enormous oak trees formed a perfect triangle around the edge, their trunks easily 8 feet across. In the center, a small fire burned without any visible fuel, just flames dancing over bare earth. And beside the fire sat a woman. She looked about 30, with long dark hair braided with feathers and small bones. Her dress was colonial era, indigo blue with a white apron, but it was clean and perfect, like she'd just put it on. When she looked up at me, her eyes were the pale green of deep water and old, so much older than her face. "Margaret Thornfield," she said, and her voice carried despite speaking softly. "Descendant of Judge Ezekiel Thornfield. You're right on time." I raised my camera and took a picture. The flash seemed to bounce off her like she was made of mirror, but she didn't blink or look away. "You're Sarah Whitethorn," I said. It wasn't a question. She smiled, and it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. "I am, though I haven't been called by that name in many years. The Cherokee called me Burning Sky Woman. The colonists called me Witch. What do you call me, child of my murderers?" My hands were shaking now, and not from cold. This couldn't be real. But my camera had just taken her picture, and when I checked the back display, there she was, clear as day, sitting by an impossible fire in a clearing that shouldn't exist. "I call you a victim," I said finally. "What happened to you was wrong." She tilted her head, studying me. Was it? I did learn the old ways from Cherokee healers. I did make medicines the town doctors couldn't match. I did help women birth their babies safely when the midwives failed. And when those same doctors started losing patients to someone who charged nothing and saved lives they couldn't. Yes, I cursed them. Every man who condemned me, I cursed his bloodline to know the pain I felt. The fire flared higher as she spoke, and the temperature around the clearing dropped another 10 degrees. Frost started forming on the fallen leaves. "The hikers," I said. "You've been calling them here." "Their ancestors stole my life," Sarah said. "But I'm not unreasonable. I offer each descendant the same choice I never had: power for justice, knowledge for sacrifice, the ability to right the wrongs their families committed." She stood up, and as she did, the clearing changed around us. The trees grew larger, the sky darker. When I looked at my watch, it showed a different time than it had moments before. 3:33 p.m., though I'd entered the forest at noon and couldn't have been walking for more than 2 hours. "What kind of power?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Sarah walked to one of the great oaks and placed her hand on its bark. The tree shuddered, and suddenly its trunk was covered in symbols carved deep into the wood. Cherokee writing mixed with other marks I couldn't identify. "The power I learned before they killed me," she said. "Plant knowledge, weather working, the ability to see through time and speak with the dead, the skills to heal what seems hopeless and protect those who can't protect themselves." She turned back to me, and now her eyes held flecks of fire. "Your ancestors took that from the world when they took my life, but you could bring it back. Learn what I learned. Use it to help people the way I tried to help them." It sounded almost reasonable, almost appealing, but there was something in her voice, something hungry, that made me step back. "What's the cost?" I asked. Sarah's smile turned sharp. "Justice, for every descendant of those who wronged me. They must pay for their ancestors' sins, not with their lives. I'm not as cruel as they were, but they must feel the fear I felt, the helplessness, the knowledge that their world can be taken away in an instant." The fire behind her roared up suddenly, 15 feet high, and in the flames I saw images. People I recognized from town, descendants of old families, running through the woods in terror, screaming as shadows chased them, begging for mercy they'd never receive. "That's not justice," I said. "That's revenge." "What's the difference?" Sarah asked, and for the first time, she sounded truly dangerous. "My knowledge died with me. Generations of women suffered in childbirth because the healing arts were called witchcraft. How many people died because scared men destroyed what they didn't understand? The worst part was, she was right. How many wise women had been killed over the centuries? How much knowledge lost? How many people had suffered because healing traditions were suppressed? But I thought about the hikers who'd come back terrified and confused. I thought about the look in their eyes when they tried to describe what they'd experienced. "I won't hurt innocent people," I said. The clearing went silent. Even the impossible fire stopped crackling. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I felt like she was looking right through me, seeing things about myself I didn't even know. "Then you're just like him," she said finally. "Just like your ancestor, too righteous to do what's necessary." She gestured, and suddenly I was falling through time. The clearing spun around me, the trees growing younger, the sky brightening. When everything stopped spinning, I was looking at the same place, but it was different. It was 1778, and I was watching my own ancestor condemn Sarah Whitethorn to death. I stood in the same clearing, but it was summer now and full of people. Colonial-era people in rough clothes, their faces hard with fear and anger. In the center, a wooden platform had been built, and standing on it was Judge Ezekiel Thornfield. He looked just like my father had at the same age. Same square jaw, same stubborn eyes. But where Dad had been gentle, this man radiated cold authority. "Sarah Whitethorn," he was saying, "you stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with heathen spirits, and of cursing good Christian folk with your devilry." I turned to look at the accused. and there was Sarah, but different. Younger looking, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her hands were tied behind her back, but she stood straight and unafraid. "I stand accused of healing the sick and helping women birth their children safely," she replied, her voice carrying across the crowd. "If that is witchcraft, then I am proud to be a witch." The crowd murmured angrily, but I could see some faces that looked uncertain, people who maybe had been helped by Sarah's skills. Judge Thornfield, my ancestor, slammed a wooden gavel. "You learned these arts from the Cherokee heathens. You brew potions and cast spells. Martha Henley says you cursed her husband with sickness after he refused to pay your unnatural fees." "Martha Henley's husband beats her," Sarah shot back. "I gave her herbs to prevent another pregnancy because he would kill her if she bore another child too weak to work. The sickness he suffers is guilt eating at his conscience." "Silence," Ezekiel roared. "You admit to practicing the dark arts. You admit to trafficking with spirits. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately." That's when Sarah turned and looked directly at me. Even though I was just watching some kind of vision or memory, she saw me. "Remember this, child of Thornfield," she said, and somehow only I could hear her. "Remember how justice dies when fear rules the heart." They put the noose around her neck, and I tried to close my eyes, but I couldn't look away. As the rope tightened, Sarah spoke one last time. "I curse you all," she said, her voice somehow getting stronger even as the rope choked her. "Every bloodline here, every family that stands by and watches innocents die. Your descendants will know my pain. They will feel my fear. And when the time comes, they will make the choice you refuse to make. Justice or comfort, courage or cowardice." The platform dropped, and Sarah Whitethorn died. As soon as it was over, the vision shattered. I was back in the present-day clearing, gasping and shaking. But Sarah was still there, standing by her impossible fire. "Now you understand," she said. "Now you see what kind of man your ancestor was." I did understand, and it made me sick. Ezekiel Thornfield had been a coward, too afraid of change to see past his prejudices. He'd killed a woman for being different, for knowing things he didn't. But that didn't make Sarah's revenge right. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry for what he did, for what they all did. But terrorizing innocent people won't bring you peace." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Peace? Child, I gave up on peace 2 centuries ago. I want justice, and if you won't help me get it." She gestured again, and the world shifted around us. Suddenly I was watching myself from outside, but I was in different clothes. Modern clothes, but not the park ranger uniform I'd worn today. I was wearing a fancy dress, standing at a podium, speaking to a crowd of people. Sarah Whitethorn was a healer, not a witch, the other me was saying. She saved lives, helped the poor, and was murdered for her knowledge. Today, we finally honor her memory with this memorial. I watched myself unveil a bronze plaque in the clearing. People in the crowd were crying, including several women who looked like descendants of Cherokee families. "This could be real," Sarah said in my ear. "Accept my bargain, and this future becomes yours. Refuse, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have made a difference." The vision changed. Now I was seeing myself as an old woman, teaching young girls about herbal medicine. They hung on my every word, learning skills that could save lives. Knowledge that had been lost for generations was being preserved again. "You could heal people," Sarah whispered. "Like I did, like I never got to finish doing. All those women who died in childbirth after I was gone, all those children who suffered from fevers I could have cured. You could make up for that. The vision shifted one more time. I saw myself in a hospital, holding the hand of a young mother who was dying from complications the doctors couldn't fix. But in this vision, I knew what to do. I gave her something that saved her life, and she went home to her family. "Stop," I said, but my voice was weak, because it was tempting. God help me, it was tempting. "The knowledge is yours," Sarah said. "The power to heal, to help, to right centuries of wrongs. All you have to do is help me finish what was started. Give the descendants of my murderers a choice, face their family's guilt, or run like cowards." I thought about the hikers who'd reported the missing time. They'd all been scared, but they hadn't been hurt. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe they just needed to acknowledge what their families had done. But then I remembered the terror in their eyes. The way they'd talked about feeling helpless, trapped, hunted. Whatever Sarah was doing to them wasn't just showing them the truth. It was punishing them for crimes they didn't commit. "There has to be another way," I said. Sarah's expression hardened. There was another way. For 206 years, I waited for someone from your bloodline to come here and make things right. You're the first Thornfield to set foot in this clearing since your ancestor left it after my execution. Do you know what I've done with all that waiting time? The fire behind her flared again, and in the flames I saw images that made my blood freeze. Other clearings, other forests, all across Appalachian mountains, and in each one, a figure like Sarah waiting in the shadows. "I found the others," she said. "Every woman executed for witchcraft in these mountains. Every healer murdered by frightened men. They're all awake now, all waiting for justice. This isn't just about me anymore, Margaret. This is about 2 centuries of silenced voices demanding to be heard." The temperature around the clearing dropped so fast, I could see my breath turning to ice crystals. The shadows between the trees grew deeper, and I caught glimpses of movement. Other figures, other women in period dress, stepping out of the darkness between the massive trunks. "Choose quickly," Sarah said, and her voice was no longer alone. A dozen other voices spoke with her, all demanding justice, all hungry for revenge. "The storm is coming, and once it arrives, you won't be leaving this clearing until you've made your decision." I looked up at the sky through the canopy, and she was right. Black clouds were gathering impossibly fast, and I could hear thunder in the distance. But this wasn't a natural storm. This was something much worse. The wind picked up so fast it nearly knocked me over. One moment the air was still, the next it was howling through the clearing like a hurricane. But the fire in the center never flickered, and Sarah's hair didn't move in the wind. The other figures stepped fully into the clearing now. 8 women in colonial-era dress, all young, all beautiful, all dead. Their eyes held the same otherworldly fire as Sarah's, and when they spoke, their voices layered together like a deadly chorus. 2 centuries of waiting, they said in unison. 2 centuries of watching our knowledge die, our wisdom forgotten, our murders unpunished. I backed toward the edge of the clearing, but the massive oak trees seemed to lean inward, their branches forming an impenetrable wall. When I tried to push through, the bark felt warm to the touch, almost alive. "You can't leave," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the wind. "Not until you choose. Accept the power I offer and help us find justice, or refuse and join us in death." "That's not a choice," I shouted back. "That's just a different kind of murder." "Is it?" One of the other women stepped forward. She was maybe 25, with burn scars covering half her face. "I'm Rebecca Marsh. They burned me alive in 1782 for healing a child their doctor said would die. The boy lived, I died. Where was the choice in that? Another woman joined her, this one with a rope burn around her throat. Hannah Price, hanged in 1791 for helping women prevent unwanted pregnancies. The same women who later starved to death because they couldn't feed the children forced on them. More stories followed. Mary Blackwood, drowned in 1785 for predicting a harsh winter that killed half the settlement. Elizabeth Turner, stoned to death in 1789 for curing a man's impotence with herbs. Each one a healer, each one murdered for knowledge that threatened someone's authority. We gave our lives trying to help people, Sarah said. We were killed for it. And then our knowledge was lost, and countless others died who could have been saved. Tell me that isn't murder. The worst part was, she was right. How many women had died in childbirth over the centuries because midwifery skills were suppressed? How many children had suffered from illnesses these women could have cured? But I thought about my grandmother's words. Men fear what they don't understand. Wasn't this the same thing, just reversed? These spirits were afraid of forgiveness, afraid of letting go, so they chose revenge instead. The storm overhead was getting worse. Lightning flashed between the clouds, but the thunder sounded wrong, more like screams than natural noise. I could feel electricity in the air, making my skin tingle. What happens to their descendants if I say yes? I asked. The people you're hunting, what exactly do you do to them? Sarah smiled, and for the first time it looked genuinely happy. We give them the same choice we're giving you. Accept responsibility for their ancestors' crimes and work to make amends, or experience the fear and helplessness we felt. And if they choose fear? The smile faded. Then they learn what it feels like to be hunted, to be powerless, to know that death is coming, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. You're talking about driving people insane. I'm talking about justice, Sarah screamed, and the fire behind her exploded upward like a geyser. They get to live, which is more mercy than we received. They just have to live with the knowledge of what their families destroyed. I closed my eyes and tried to think. These women had been wronged, terribly wronged. They deserved acknowledgement, deserved to have their stories told and their knowledge preserved. But this wasn't the way. There's another option, I said suddenly. What if I could get your stories officially recorded? What if I could make sure the world knows what really happened to you? The wind died down a little. The spirits looked at each other, and for a moment they seemed less like vengeful ghosts and more like confused, angry women. Words on paper? Rebecca said skeptically. We've been forgotten for 200 years. What makes you think anyone would care now? Because times have changed, I said. Women's voices matter now in ways they didn't then. I can write your stories, get them published in historical journals. I can petition the state to put up memorials, to acknowledge what happened. I can make sure your knowledge is preserved and taught. And the descendants of our murderers? Hannah asked. They just go free? They go educated, I said. They learn what their families did. They have the chance to make amends by supporting historical preservation, by learning your healing arts, by honoring your memory instead of ignoring it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at me. The other spirits waited for her decision. You would do this? She asked finally. You would spend your life fighting to preserve our memory, even knowing it would be thankless work that most people would dismiss us as just old superstitions? Yes, I said, and I meant it. But you have to let go of the revenge. You have to stop hunting people who had nothing to do with what happened to you. They carry the blood of our murderers. They also carry your blood, I pointed out. Some of those families intermarried over the generations. You could be terrorizing your own descendants. That hit home. I saw several of the spirits flinch, including Sarah. The Cherokee taught me something before I died, Sarah said slowly. They said that pain not released becomes poison. That anger held too long turns inward and destroys the holder. She looked around at her fellow spirits. Maybe we've held our anger too long. The storm above us was weakening. The thunder was farther away now, and I could see patches of normal sky through the clouds. Help me do this the right way, I said. Tell me your stories. Let me write them down properly. Work with me to preserve your knowledge instead of using it for revenge. Sarah closed her eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When she opened them again, the fire in them had dimmed to something almost normal. Very well, she said, but if you fail, if you let our stories be forgotten again, we'll be waiting. One by one, the other spirits nodded agreement and began to fade. As each one disappeared, she whispered her story to me, filling my mind with details I'd need to write their histories properly. Sarah was the last to go. She walked over to where I stood and held out her hand. When I took it, her skin felt real, warm, alive. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing us as women instead of monsters. Thank you, I replied, for trusting me with your stories. She smiled one last time, sadly but peacefully, and then she was gone. The fire went out, the clearing returned to normal, and I was alone with 9 women's stories burning in my memory like sacred flames. The hike back to my truck took 4 hours, though it should have taken 2. My compass worked normally now, and my GPS showed the right coordinates, but I kept stopping to write in my notebook. The spirit stories were so vivid in my memory, I was afraid I'd lose details if I didn't get them down immediately. Each woman's voice was still clear in my head. Sarah's defiant courage, Rebecca's quiet determination, Hannah's fierce protection of other women. They'd been healers, teachers, midwives, women who'd used their knowledge to help their communities and died for it. By the time I reached my truck, I had 12 pages of notes and a lifetime's worth of work ahead of me. It took me 2 years to get Sarah's story officially recognized. I wrote papers for historical journals, contacted genealogical societies, and lobbied the State Historical Commission. The breakthrough came when I found Sarah's grimoire, her book of healing recipes and Cherokee plant lore, hidden in a hollow tree near the execution site. The grimoire was authentic 18th century work, written in Sarah's own hand. It contained medical knowledge that was surprisingly advanced for its time, proving she'd been a skilled healer rather than a delusional woman practicing witchcraft. The state put up a memorial plaque in the clearing where she died. It reads, Sarah Whitethorn, 1748-1778, healer, herbalist, and victim of persecution. She died for practicing the healing arts that threatened those in power. May her knowledge live on, and her story never be forgotten. I kept my promise to the other spirits, too. 8 more memorials went up across the mountains, each telling the story of a woman murdered for her healing knowledge. I also started a program through the Park Service to preserve traditional Cherokee and Appalachian medicine, working with tribal elders and local historians to document what survived. The descendants of the original accusers had mixed reactions when I contacted them. Some were horrified to learn what their ancestors had done and volunteered to help with the memorial project. Others dismissed the whole thing as ancient history that had nothing to do with them. The hikers who'd experienced the missing time episodes never had another incident. Whatever Sarah and the others had been doing to them stopped completely after our encounter in the clearing. Most of them got involved with the historical preservation work once they understood what had really happened. As for me, well, I learned things in that clearing that I've never told anyone. Not just the spirit stories, but other knowledge too. Plant lore that wasn't in any book. Healing techniques the Cherokee shamans taught Sarah before her death. Skills that probably saved my daughter's lives when conventional medicine failed them. I never figured out how much of what I experienced was real and how much was some kind of supernatural vision. The photographs I took of Sarah came out blank, just shots of an empty clearing with a fire pit that disappeared by morning, but Sarah's grimoire was real enough. The state archaeologist authenticated it, and it's on display at the Cherokee Museum now. What I do know is that the mountains feel different now, peaceful. The unnatural silence is gone, replaced by normal forest sounds. Other rangers have commented on it too, though they don't know why. Sometimes when I'm alone in the deep woods, I catch the scent of burning sage on the wind. Not threatening like it was that day, but comforting, like someone saying thank you. I kept detailed records of everything, of course. It's all filed away in the Park Service archives, along with copies of the historical documentation we uncovered. Future researchers will have access to the real story, not just the sanitized version that painted the accusers as righteous defenders of Christianity. But late at night, when I'm reviewing those files, I sometimes wonder about the other stories we haven't uncovered yet. How many more women died for their knowledge across Appalachian history? How many spirits are still waiting for someone to acknowledge their pain and preserve their wisdom? The mountains are old, and they have long memories. Sarah Whitethorn's story was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of suppressed knowledge and feminine wisdom, destroyed by fear and ignorance. I've got 16 more years until retirement. That should be enough time to find a few more of those lost stories, to put up a few more memorial plaques, to make sure a few more wise women aren't forgotten by history. Because the dead don't stay quiet forever. Sometimes they just need someone living to listen to their stories and make sure the world remembers that they were here, that they mattered, that their knowledge was worth preserving. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind in the mountains, you can still hear them whispering their secrets to anyone brave enough to write them down. The work continues. The stories wait to be told. And somewhere in the ancient forests of the Appalachians, the spirits of murdered wise women rest a little easier, knowing that someone finally heard their voices and chose to remember their names.